This is the July 6, 2023 Planning Commission hearing. We will call the hearing to order right on time. It's 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. Ms. Esparza, can we please have a roll call?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. I'll take a roll call. Chair Bonderson?
Here.
Vice Chair Bauke?
Here.
Commissioner Boss?
Present.
Commissioner DeLuccio?
Here.
Commissioner Lodge?
Here.
Commissioner Wardlow?
Here.
And Commissioner Wiscombe.
Here.
We have quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, let's move on to preliminary matters. We will go ahead and begin with requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, and ex-agenda items. Mr. Musk, good afternoon. Do we have any of these?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. We have none.
None. Very good. And do we have any announcements or appeals at this time?
Also none.
Also none. That's off to a good start. Thank you, Mr. Busk. So let's move on to review, consideration, and action on the following draft Planning Commission minutes for June 15, 2023. Before I open this up, I just want to see if any planning commissioners have comments or edits of any type for this the series of minutes. I see none. Are there any public speaker comments for these minutes? Ms. Esparza?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. If anyone attending virtually would like to speak on the approval of minutes, please raise your hand and we can call on you. Not seeing any raised hands, and then we do not have any speakers. So with that, back to you.
So do I have a motion for this?
So moved.
Thank you very much. We have a motion from Commissioner Wiscombe and a second from Commissioner DeLuccio. Are there any discussion? No discussions? Go ahead and please take a roll call vote for us.
Thank you. I'll take a roll call vote. Commissioner Boss?
Yes.
Commissioner DeLuccio?
Yes.
Commissioner Lodge?
Yes.
Commissioner Wardlow?
Yes.
Commissioner Wiscombe?
Yes.
Vice Chair Bauke?
Yes.
And Chair Bonderson.
I will abstain. I was absent.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you as well. And so we will now move on to item D, that is comments from members of the public pertaining to items that are not on today's agenda. Mrs. Barza, do we have any in-person or remote public speakers at this time?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. If anyone participating virtually on Zoom would like to speak on general business on items not on today's agenda, please raise your hand and we can call on you. Not seeing any raised hands, and I do not have any speaker slips, so with that, I'll turn it back to the commission. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our new item. This is a presentation from city staff on the draft Objective Design and Development Standards, affectionately called ODDS. You'll likely hear that term, that shortcut all day today, so be aware, ODDS. And we were going to receive public comment, hold a discussion, and provide initial feedback to staff. So without further ado, I will just quickly ask my colleagues if there are any ex parte communications or comments prior to beginning this item that need to be disclosed at this time. I see none. So Ms. Deisty, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Okay. Thank you and good afternoon, Chair Bonderson and members of the Commission. I'm Rosie Deisty, Project Planner with Community Development Department, and I'm here today to give you an overview of the draft Objective Design and Development Standards, or affectionately called ODDS. So we're here today, I'm here today with my city staff team that includes Dan Gullett, Brenda Beltz, and Dana Falk, all of Community Development Department, and also our consultants to the project, Stefan Pellegrini and Tony Perez. And I will start the presentation with context and background, and then I'll turn the presentation over to our consultant team, who will provide an overview of the Objective Design and Development Standards, and then I'll conclude with some questions and next steps. Today's meeting is intended as an introduction and an overview rather than a decision hearing, and this is because we acknowledge it's a complex topic and the document is a long and complex document to review. We don't necessarily expect the Commission or the public have had the time to review the document in sufficient detail for an in-depth conversation at this time. We do plan to convene the work group to this project, which I'll talk about in a minute, meeting after this one so we can discuss details with that work group, and also return to your commission later this year to ask for recommendations from the work group and to hold a more detailed discussion and ask specific questions, which I'll touch on later in this presentation. So I wanted to start with why are we doing objective design standards for housing? So first, the state has recognized that the housing shortage is a statewide crisis. And one solution to this crisis is to pass new state laws that replace subjective design review with a more predictable and potentially streamlined review that could be provided for with objective standards only. For years, our city has relied on multiple design guidelines and the comments from our design review boards to form buildings into desired aesthetic standards that set Santa Barbara apart from other cities in California. But due to these new state laws, this option is not always available now. We could, for example, use our objective zoning standards, and those prescribe setbacks and height limits, but it doesn't provide for building articulation, style, or use of quality materials. A building like that would probably not fit gracefully into our neighborhoods or meet the city's goals for a pedestrian-oriented environment. So we're proposing this new alternative path of using objective design standards that comply with state law and provide this as a review option for applicants who choose to use it. Applicants can still opt to use our current design guidelines and design review process for projects that want to propose a different style or not conform to the standards that you'll see before you today in the odds. So, I'm sorry, I'm one slide behind. I'll go to the next slide. To initiate this project, the city applied for and was awarded a grant from the State Department of Housing and Community Development to develop and adopt objective design standards. As staff, we didn't have the expertise for a project of this scope, so we prepared a request for proposals. We received 3 proposals and interviewed 3 firms before the review committee selected Optikos Design as our consultant. Optikos' designers and architects are known as leaders in designing for pedestrian-oriented missing middle housing, which is described as a diverse and sustainable type of housing and this type of housing was commonly built in our city in the past decades. These include duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, and multiplexes. Optikos is also known for preparing form-based codes. For example, they created an objective design and development standards toolkit for Marin County that is being customized and adopted by the cities within the county as their own objective standards. For this project, the consultant's role was to conduct research and understand the existing context, facilitate our work group meetings, prepare the draft design standards, and attend and present the project at a select number of hearings. Staff has been tasked with managing the work group meetings, conducting public engagement, providing data to the consultant, review and input on the draft work products, writing staff reports, and making presentations. We'll also be doing the environmental review and developing a review process, application forms and materials and things like that. The overarching goals for this project are to increase predictability and confidence in the process with consistent expectations for desirable results, promote a livable city, and we would do this by supporting diverse housing types and engage the streetscape to create a vibrant and walkable community, respect the context of Santa Barbara's existing built and natural environment with buildings and design that reflect the city's vision of exemplary architecture, and create a visual language to better communicate local standards with photographs, illustrations, maps, and tables in a catalog of agreed-upon designs. Your packet includes a list of general plan goals and policies that support development of design standards, and I wanted to highlight one that's really central to these policies and goals, and this comes out of the draft housing element. It's policy 1.5, to establish citywide objective design standards, and we also have a related program, HE7, which implements this policy with adoption of objective design standards. This slide shows a map of the project area, and use of objective design standards will be available as an option for projects in areas of the city that are zoned for 2 or more residential units, as shown on the map. So that's the areas in green. I wanted to clarify as well that this product is only meant for new buildings. It's not meant to be used if someone's doing adaptive reuse of an existing building or remodels. Also, use in the coastal zone, which is outlined in blue on the map, will require a follow-up local coastal plan amendment. So we would submit that to the California Coastal Commission after these are locally adopted for the inland areas. Also, just to clarify, this will not apply to single-unit homes, non-residential projects, accessory dwelling units, mobile home parks, or projects that require a discretionary action, such as a zoning modification. I'm going to go over some of the major milestones that we've achieved thus far. So again, we started in 2021 with the grant award and selecting Opticos as our consultant. At that time, we also formed a work group, and that's comprised of Mr. Bauke of your commission, plus members of the Architectural Board of Review, Historic Landmarks Commission, local American Institute of Architects, and they were formed to advise staff and review draft documents. In 2022, Opticos visited the city, did research, and prepared an existing commission's memo, and they'll describe that in more detail later in this presentation. We also introduced the project to Architectural Board of Review and Historic Landmarks Commission in October, and we released an admin draft of this document, and that was available for anyone to review, the work group, staff, and public. This allowed us a really long review period that we thought was really helpful because it gave us time to prepare detailed comments. We also prepared a visual preferences survey that I'll talk about in a minute and did other community engagement efforts in 2022. Then this year we returned to Architectural Board of Review and HLC to get input on the admin draft. The public review draft of this document was released just about 2 weeks ago. And then we plan to hold adoption hearings by the end of the year and continue community engagement throughout. Next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about community engagement. So we started by preparing a webpage dedicated to this project and made an overview video and a fact sheet that I recommend you look at. It has really good information just about the project and why we're doing it. We also use this webpage to broadcast meeting announcements. We post all the work group meeting agendas and videos, because thus far they've all been virtual. And any kind of documents and everything that's in your packet is posted here. So again, over the course of the project, we've had 5 public work group meetings and 1 study session with the work group. Again, we went to Historic Landmarks Commission and Architectural Board of Review twice, and we also had a special meeting with American Institute of Architects Advocacy Group. Continuing with public outreach, again, we posted the admin draft in October. We had a public comment period that went through December, although we continued to accept and respond to public comments up into the spring of 2023. We got a number of comments from work group members, as well as the public, and then some input again from other HLC and ABR members. A team of staff went through the document in detail and provided extensive input to Opticos to get to the public review draft that you have before you today. This slide just summarizes some of the main revisions we made from the admin draft to the one that you have before you today, so that the public can hear and everyone else listening what the main changes were. So we did hear from some members and the public that they thought the document was a little bit long and repetitive, so we were able to suggest consolidating and removing some chapters, which we were able to get the size down that way. We also heard there was a preference for local photos, so we were able to have a number of local photos inserted to customize it for our city. And then we asked Opticos to make edits to clarify again that these only apply to new buildings, not remodels or adaptive reuse. We took a look at the zone names and the map that was proposed, and we recommended changing the names to better reflect our city's setting. And we did a detailed review of the proposed zone map to ensure the zones outlined in that map line up with our existing underlying uses and intended forms. We also recommended an architectural styles map that I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Then we also looked at all the building types that Opticos proposed, and we recommended removing a few building types and also adding a few building types based on our existing lot sizes and what we typically see here in the city. And then finally, we took a close look at all the standards and how they work under the odds versus Title 30 and made some adjustments to calibrate those. So we released the visual preferences survey around the same time as the admin draft, and we asked folks how appealing or attractive the respondent considered building types that we gave as samples. It was not meant to focus on architectural style, but I think people answering the survey had a hard time decoupling style from type, which is understandable. We had about 60 people take the survey. Most of them were Santa Barbara homeowners. And they tended to favor house-scale buildings, or if a building was larger, they preferred it in Spanish colonial revival style. The survey was used to guide staff in recommending removing the townhouse building type that you see here from the admin draft odds, and then adding the side court instead as a building type because we felt it fit in better with our city. At the onset of this project, we knew we, again, wanted to couple building form standards with standards for architectural styles. And we had funding that allowed development of 3 style groups. They're Mediterranean, Craftsman, and Contemporary, and each one has 2 substyles. Opticos will provide more details in their presentation about all that. But staff was asked to recommend where each style group would be allowed in the project area. As you know, our city already has style restrictions in place. For example, El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District requires a sort of Mediterranean style group. So we accounted for those style requirements and we looked at all the existing and proposed landmark and historic districts in making our recommendations. We also reviewed existing design guidelines to see if there was anything in them that directed certain styles in certain areas of the city. And we did get a lot of public input on this topic as well. So once we completed our initial style recommendations, we took the opportunity to go to the community and review this architectural styles map at the city open house that occurred in May 2023. This was held at De La Guerra Plaza. So we had a big copy of the map out. And on this map, which is a little bit different from the map that's in the document, but yellow would allow the Mediterranean style group, green would allow Mediterranean craftsman, and blue allows all 3 style groups, Mediterranean, craftsman, and contemporary. So we asked participants to place dots on the map, and if the dots matched the base colors, they agreed with our proposed styles. If it was contrary, then it shows they disagreed and had different ideas. So a blue dot in a green area means all styles should be allowed and not restricted. So we were able to take this input as well when we refined the styles map. So now I'm going to shift over to Mr. Pellegrini of Opticos Design to present an overview of the document that's before you today.
Thank you, Rosie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stefan Pellegrini. Thank you very much for hosting us today. I'm principal at Opticos Design, and I'm joined by my colleague, Senior Associate Tony Perez, who has been leading this effort and managing the project together with the city. Today, I'd like to provide an introduction to the Objective Design and Development Standards. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, great. So these are the 4 topics that I'm going to be talking about today. The first one is, what are the objective standards? I'm going to talk a little bit more about where they apply in the city. I'm going to go into some background on what we learned from the existing conditions process and how that actually was input into the standards. And then I'll conclude by providing an overview of the objective standards that you have in front of you. So a little bit more, just to start on objective design standards. The California Government Code provides us with this definition: standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. And so when many of us are accustomed to discretionary processes and relying on situations where we have the ability to use our discretion about determining what's appropriate with regards to scale or character or style, that's really confronted with, in contrast, this challenge to make standards objective that can support more streamlined review and approval of projects. Next slide, please. So recognizing the form that we have in Santa Barbara, it really was important for us to understand how the objective standards could reflect development that was oriented to the pedestrian in its nature and scale. We are very interested in understanding how new housing types could produce more housing in the core area of the city, with prevalence, as we discussed before, for these missing middle building types. These are house-scale building types that can provide more diverse housing opportunities. And we're also very interested in buildings that would fit well with existing development. And this is reflected in the form and character and scale of development that the objective standards are trying to promote, as well as the architectural style. And I'll talk a little bit about those sort of two concepts moving forward. Next slide, please. As Rosie mentioned, the objective design and development standards will apply to all commercial and residential parcels in the city that allow 2 or more housing units. So these include areas where duplexes are allowed today, multifamily zone districts, and mixed-use zoning districts where residential isn't allowed use throughout the city. And our methodology for developing these standards really takes a form-based approach. We looked very carefully at both the existing character of the different neighborhoods and districts within the city, with an emphasis on what were the prevailing patterns. We also really dove into the existing standards that are used to direct development within these areas, to understand what the intended physical character was, looking at sort of these two directions in tandem. This started early on in the process, where we had an opportunity to visit a variety of recently constructed projects in the project area together with staff. This helped us to understand what the existing standards were producing, but also the changes and iterations that the discretionary process was actually allowing to sort of get to sort of the end result, the built result that was usually positively reflected in the community. In this stage, we also had a number of stakeholder interviews. We had an opportunity to speak with designers, architects, landscape architects, who were accustomed to submitting applications to the city. We had an opportunity to speak to real estate professionals who had worked to entitle and build projects in the city. And we also had a chance to interface with advocates for historic preservation and social and environmental justice. And the information that we compiled with that is summarized in the existing conditions report. A lot of interesting information about the entitlements process, concerns about development approvals, and just the, maintaining the quality and character of development within the city. This is some additional work from existing conditions analysis. We really started to understand what the existing zoning, in terms of the zoning envelope, was producing. And this was sort of a good starting point for us to sort of understand the initial direction for sort of the built zoning envelope. We looked at this across different zone districts in the city and also across different lot sizes, understanding that in some places there are existing zone districts which actually are applying to a whole variety of lot sizes, which actually results in different outcomes. And we sought to sort of understand what the existing zoning was producing. Next slide, please. At the same time, we looked carefully at the neighborhoods in the project area to understand what some of the prevailing patterns were within these neighborhoods. Sometimes we realized that there was an alignment between what the existing zoning was producing and the prevailing patterns. Other times there were differences, and it was good for us to sort of understand those. Where we saw instances or occurrences of things, we would actually denote that and document that. Where we saw prevailing patterns, that it was sort of patterns of things that were repeating from parcel to parcel, we use that as the basis to understand something that should be informed or included in this exploration of objective standards. One concept that came up here, which we'll talk about during this presentation and probably later today, is differentiating between what is house-scaled and block-scaled. In EPV, in the central core of the city, we really have a fabric of buildings that actually are defining the streets and blocks. They're going to the zero lot line condition at the front and the sides, and we have buildings that actually are creating spaces. Within the adjacent neighborhoods, side yard setbacks, front yard setbacks, and the scale of buildings that actually is more house scaled is really sort of what's informing and making the character of those neighborhoods. And we wanted to make sure that the objective standards could sort of fit across a spectrum of conditions that would allow both that house scale and block scale. If you go to the next slide, please. We also looked at things that were informing architectural style within these neighborhoods and looked for the prevalence. Again, are styles actually appearing in these areas versus are they prevalent? Are they repeating? Is there a justification to actually provide a basis for architectural style moving forward as an objective standard? And what this resulted in was our recommendations for the architectural styles that are included in the odds, as well as sort of the classification of them into style groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on in the presentation. Just to reiterate this concept that I introduced before, differentiating between block scale and house scale, and understanding that there's sort of a whole variety, a spectrum of conditions that are appearing in central Santa Barbara and in the project area. And this really resulted, on the next slide, in the objective standards being organized into a series or a palette of 5 zones. And these are actually producing or intend to produce a spectrum of intensity from something that actually is more lower intensity on one edge of the spectrum to provide housing within a neighborhood environment of house-scale buildings. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the core of the EPV, where we're really producing higher intensity buildings that actually are making block-scaled environments. And again, we see this as a spectrum, and we're presenting these reflected on the zoning map in a way that are intending to reflect the different environments, the palette of different environments that we see in the project area. This is reflected on the zone map that you'll see on the following slide. At the most intense, the downtown core in sort of the bright purple color, and then moving down through the spectrum of what we see at the edge of the EPV, the mixed-use corridors, which actually extend out from the EPV along Haley, Upper State, and Milpas. The neighborhoods around the core of the EPV, which are really characterized by more intense multifamily environments, and then the neighborhood medium, where we have sort of transition to smaller scale multifamily buildings to the adjacent single-family neighborhoods around the core. So now I'm going to take you through the objective design standards to provide an introduction to the content. The standards are actually organized into a series of 10 chapters, and I'll go through a little bit these in a little bit more detail, touching on some of the key features. But just to give you sort of a starting point, the standards include an introduction that provides a basis and an intent for the work. The spectrum of zones that I described previously are described in Chapter 2. There is additional information that's guiding site design standards in Chapter 3, as well as additional information that's providing more detailed guidance for the zoning envelope in Chapter 4 under building types. And then there is specific attention to frontages, that is sort of the design of buildings as the transition area between the back of the sidewalk and the front face of the building. That can be found in Chapter 5. Attention to architectural design in Chapter 6. Attention to large site standards in Chapter 7. That is applicable in situations where you have larger parcels, where there's an expectation of subdivision into streets and blocks to make a project. There's guidance in Chapter 8 for community open space, which is closely related to the design of large sites. There's a chapter on exceptions, which I'll talk a little bit more about in detail, as well as definitions that are designed to supplement the information that exists in Title 30 today. So starting with Chapter 2, what we find here is guidance for the basic zoning envelope that each of these zones provides. The majority of this information is actually organized into a series of 4 pages that include the intent of the zone and the basic dimensional standards that are actually providing the zoning envelope for that site. This is organized into a series of objective tables and diagrams that gets you to sort of the basic zoning envelope for each of these zone districts. Chapter 3 includes additional information that's guiding site design standards, and there's some attention here that I want to point you to that is particularly for zone transitions. This is additional supplemental information when buildings need to transition to a differently scaled environment that is adjacent. Here we see standards for larger buildings that are being placed next to less intense or zones that deliver smaller buildings. There is particular attention to reduce the mass of buildings at corners, and that actually is in order to contribute to additional open space, light, and views at the street corners, which we were seeing as an outcome of many projects designed, particularly in the core. There's guidance as well for transition to adjacent historic resources and the need to reduce the scale and form of buildings that are adjacent. We realized in our documentation that this was a key activity of the review boards when they were looking at projects to make sure that these transitions were being adequately taken care of. So it was important for us to actually address these in objective standards. Chapter 4 provides guidance for building types, and this is sort of a way to think about a more detailed outcome of the zoning envelope. And this is really sort of something that is designed to provide that and ensure that buildings actually that go into these environments are compatible in form and scale to what we see in the neighborhoods today. This ranges from, as I mentioned, house-scale buildings, which there is additional direction to the footprint of those buildings and how they can be placed on parcels, all the way up to sort of commercial mixed-use buildings in size. And one of the things this also directs for is that in environments where there is a limitation on the building footprint, you can actually achieve a project by assembling multiple buildings on a parcel, as opposed to going with sort of a larger building that actually might be in great contrast to the scale of buildings that we actually see adjacent. The next chapter actually addresses frontage. I mentioned that this is specific attention to the transition between the back of the sidewalk and the face of the building. And this provides, again, a spectrum or a variety of conditions that is designed to allow for a good, consistent pedestrian realm. And you can see that these frontage types are actually organized by zone, with the more residential frontages being allocated to the less intense zone districts, and the more sort of mixed-use commercial storefront style frontages existing in the core zone districts. So now I'm going to turn a little bit to talk more about architectural design. This is a different version of the map that Rosie showed previously, but it shows sort of our direction and recommendation for the style groups based on the information that we learned during the existing conditions documentation process. So you can see that the core here focused on the EPV with the Mediterranean style group. In the core neighborhoods around, there is a recommendation for the Mediterranean and Craftsman style groups. And then as we sort of move out to sort of the outer areas of the project area, there's suggestions for the maximum amount of diversity with both Mediterranean, Craftsman, and contemporary style groups being reflected. All of these style groups actually start with a section in this chapter that pays attention to massing and facade composition and sort of the primary components of assembling buildings. So there's some additional information here, particularly for larger buildings in more intense urban environments, that provide some additional direction. And one of the things I think that was sort of important to reflect here is that there is a lot of sort of diversity and creativity that architects use when they are providing new buildings in this area. And we wanted to understand not only what portions of that would actually be allowed by the objective standards, but also that a lot of that could continue forward, again, in the absence of this opportunity for discretionary review. And then this chapter sort of follows with this information on the 3 style groups. At a big picture, these sort of provide direction for Craftsman, Mediterranean, and contemporary styles. This includes information on sort of the essential characteristics for each of these, as well as some additional information that actually is provided for subsets or sort of different interpretations of those styles that actually might be allowed or encouraged. We have to sort of try to find a balance here between allowing everything and being able to sort of document and describe something that can be met with some objective standards. So we've really tried to sort of find a balance here in this chapter between those two things, between being sort of allowing enough creativity and diversity, but also limiting and providing some predictability to what the outcome can be. And that information is really encased in the standards that are sort of included for each subsection. What we've tried to do here is provide guidance that's providing enough direction for the essential elements while allowing for some creativity in how those actually can be interpreted. So a key thing to sort of think about here is that the dimensional standards, the things that are indicated in the diagrams, are really what we are trying to promote with an objective standard. This could translate, for example, to a minimum depth for a cornice or an eave, but then actually allow a lot of different ways that that cornice or eave could be expressed in order to provide that minimum depth. So we're trying to sort of provide a wider range of outcomes that can occur, but only looking sort of at the essential elements that will continue and provide the character of buildings that you are also good at promoting in this environment. Chapter 7 includes specific direction for large sites. The odds do include some of these that are actually quite large. The guidance, I think, starts at 3 acres. There also is sort of an interim scale of parcels that would actually start to promote a certain degree of connectivity in the form of paseos. This provides guidance for the layout of streets and blocks, provides guidance for public access into the interiors of these sites, and ensures that they actually would be developed in a way that continues the connective pattern that we see elsewhere in the city and the project area. And Chapter 8 is tied to these large sites. There is sort of a blanket sort of 10% requirement that land that on these large sites would be set aside and organized as a series or assembly of these community open spaces. And so this chapter actually provides guidance for those different kinds of open spaces, their form and character, sort of minimum essential dimensional characteristics, and how they actually can be incorporated into those large sites. And lastly, in Chapter 9, there are a series of exceptions. These are designed to support streamlined review of projects where there might be certain conditions that are applicable only to that project where some administrative relief is actually desirable. And so you can sort of think about this as a situation where for some reason a highly objective standard is challenged or it's difficult for the applicant to actually meet that standard because of conditions on their site. It could be a heritage tree that's located on their property. It could be a situation where there is a requirement and a change in dimensional standard. This chapter actually, to the best effort possible, tries to describe those situations where an exception actually might be warranted and provides guidance for the planner to actually measure and understand how those exceptions can occur so that there is some deviation from the dimensional standard, which can be required and processed administratively as part of the application. So that concludes my introduction to the odds, and I look forward to your comments and questions on this topic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pellegrini, and we'll look forward to, there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions and for further clarifications when I'm done. I'm just going to conclude with a couple of questions and next steps before we turn it over to your commission. So your staff report includes a few questions that we recommended you consider, and we would come back to you to discuss these further when we return for a meeting on this topic. But we also separated them out into a couple of slides and felt that if you felt ready to give us input today, we could also hold that discussion and take your input now and save it, with all the other comments we get for the next iteration of this document. So I'll just repeat some of the questions that we put in your staff report. We wanted your input on the proposed maps. We have in particular, the zone map and the architectural styles map. We'd like to know your thoughts on the boundaries, the names, and in particular for architectural styles, perhaps some consideration of the contemporary style group, since that one seemed to raise the most concern from the public. We also would really like your input on the adjacency standards for new infill that Mr. Pellegrini discussed. This is in Chapter 3, Section 2503030. These standards were really well thought out, and it took a lot of discussion and effort to get to these standards because, again, we're trying to replace this sort of subjective design review process with something very objective and predictable, and that was not easy. But so we'd like to hear more about that. We made a recommendation for the downtown core area that the ground floor of buildings in that area, and this is defined as State Street from Montecito to Sola, would be required to have ground floor non-residential space. This is the only area in this document that has that particular requirement. We did consult with the State Street Master Plan folks to kind of talk to them about this concept, and our community development director. So just like to hear your thoughts on that as well. And then again, open yard requirements are very similar between Title 30 and the odds, but there are some differences. For example, the odds doesn't discuss open yard as private like Title 30 does. So we're just would like your input on that as well. So the next steps for this project is, again, we mentioned having another meeting or more if needed with our work group to go over with them in detail all the changes that were made to the document and get their input as well. We also need to coordinate this project and this process with proposed amendments to Title 30 because there's a lot of cross-references between the two documents and we want to make sure they line up closely. So we'll try to line these two efforts up as much as possible. We do plan, of course, to return to your commission to ask for a recommendation to City Council on this project as a zoning ordinance amendment, and also we would include the noticing that's necessary for a local coastal plan amendment, just so we don't forget to do that extra step. So that concludes my presentation, and we're happy to take your questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Deisty, and thank you to the consultants as well, Mr. Pellegrini, for your presentation. It was very helpful in addition to the document. And so before we get comments and questions from our Planning Commission, we're going to open the floor up for public comment. I will refer to Ms. Esparza. Would you let us know if there are any remote or in-person public comments here today?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. I'll just make the announcement. If anyone in the room would like to speak on the item, please go ahead and fill out a speaker slip and then turn it in to me. Looks like we already have one speaker slip, and that is for Mr. Fred Sweeney. Mr. Sweeney, if you'd like to come up to the podium, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Welcome, Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. How would you like to be a state legislator and legislating Monet or William Koenig to do a painting? That's what they're asking us to do, okay? Objective design standards. I have 4 points I want to talk about. I want to endorse 100% of Pat Saley's memo that was sent in today. I think you may have received it. Several of us have been working behind the scenes. We're kind of the public commenters. We're not part of the AIA or anyone else. But I want to talk about 2 other points. One is the mountain views. Really important to consider, and I'm happy that we've now entered the 21st century in planning by adopting form-based plans and an approach. I'm assuming that it will morph into other things once this part happens. So we're going to be seeing this for other parts of the city as we move forward. But mountain views are very important, not only up the streets, which Opticos has accounted for, but also in the downtown core is the view to those mountains. That's what makes Santa Barbara different than, say, Ventura. It's being able to see those mountains. So the buildings on what I call the sun side of State Street are really important. The shade side being the side of State towards Highway 101. So that may not occur in these objective design standards, but as you go through the planning process, that really needs to be paid attention to. That's what makes Santa Barbara so special. And then I want to get down to the style map, and thank you, Ms. Deisty, for all the work and listening to us of moving forward with this idea that our major entry points off the freeway need to reflect who we are as Santa Barbara in Santa Barbara's architecture that's known worldwide. That's why we suggested Mediterranean. But I want to point out 2 additional places. Milpa Street. Milpa Street for 40 years has had a document, and no, I'm not waving around secret documents. This is something you get off the shelf. It had a manual of design standards done 40 years ago. It needs to be updated because Milpa Street is the poor stepchild of State Street. And it really needs some help, and I'm not sure that allowing contemporary in total on that street is appropriate. But I can't speak for that neighborhood. That really needs to be a reach out. And then Upper Delavina Street, up near where I live, there is a burgeoning little retail that's happening from Constance up to intersection with State. Again, I think that's a little special area, and maybe we shouldn't allow full-on contemporary there. But again, that's a developing neighborhood, and there are some others in the city too. So thank you so much. I could talk another hour, but my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very impressed that you finished with 1 second to spare. You must be a pro at this. Good to see you. Thank you for being here and for doing all the work that you do with our work group as well. So before I open this up to my...
Oh, my apologies, Ms. Bonderson. We have a couple of virtual participant speakers.
Well, look at me. I was too excited. Excuse me.
Sorry
Please
about that,
go
Chair
ahead and
Bonderson.
call on our public speakers.
Thank you. And turning to virtual participants, I have a few hands raised already. Noah Boland, you're up first, followed by Steve Johnson. Noah, I'm going to go ahead and send you an unmute request. Please unmute, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hello, I hope you are doing well. My name is Noah Boland, and I am a research analyst at Heal the Ocean, a Santa Barbara nonprofit organization dedicated to ocean-related environmental issues in our county. First off, I want to thank the Planning Commission and Opticos Design for your work on this public review draft. There is a huge need for these standards in Santa Barbara, and we respect and applaud your efforts to make Santa Barbara a more livable and sustainable city while respecting the context of its existing built and natural environment. I thank the Planning Commission for considering my comments, and I want to emphasize that through my comments, I intend to contribute positively to the ODDS goals, in particular to ensure that Santa Barbara becomes more livable and more sustainable. According to the Ocean Protection Council 2018 sea level rise guidance, which is currently our best available information on sea level rise projections in the state, Santa Barbara will experience 6.6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. This type of sea level rise would impact the low-lying flood areas of Santa Barbara with regular tidal inundation and flooding. And unfortunately, in terms of housing, this sea level rise would mostly impact moderate and lower income housing. When I take a map that projects areas to be impacted by sea level rise in 2100, and I overlay it with the draft ODDS project area showing new development zone areas, it is clear that a few of these new zone districts will be directly impacted by sea level rise in 2100, if not sooner. This public review draft, while incredibly comprehensive, does not mention sea level rise, which is a massive threat to Santa Barbara's long-term sustainable development of livable areas. We request that the Planning Commission consider including objective development standards to prohibit development in zones that will be impacted by 6.6 feet or less of sea level rise. Or we request that development in these zones continue to be left to subjective judgment. In order to truly create long-term, sustainable, and livable development, these standards must acknowledge the surrounding natural environment. Sea level rise will soon make some of these proposed development zones unlivable. For truly sustainable and livable development, sea level rise must be acknowledged in these objective design and development standards. I also look forward to hearing updates from the local coastal program amendment, and I'm curious to see if they will consider sea level rise as well. Thank you again for this time, and thank you for your consideration of these comments.
Thank you. And then next we have Steve Johnson, followed by Dennis Whelan. Mr. Johnson, I've sent you an unmute request. Please unmute and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I have a very narrow focus related to top of bank for the Mission Creek. The ODDS standard appears to be relying on the existing Title 30 language for determination of top of bank. I'm hoping a commissioner could have staff require, if that's the case, and if staff thinks that the Title 30 language is in fact objective, and if so, how does that explain the 40-year difference in opinion between flood control and Creeks Division on top of bank determinations? The second point is the ODDS appears to be altering the Title 30 process for full creek setbacks. There's a top of bank, and then instead of a 25-foot setback, the setback has been increased to 35 feet. I'm wondering, was the 35 feet necessary to make something objective? Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And then next we have Dennis Whelan. Mr. Whelan, I'm sending you an unmute request. Please go ahead and mute and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Good afternoon, commissioners. You may know my name from being a member of the Architectural Board of Review, but my comments today are strictly my own. However, I had the advantage of these previous presentations by Ms. Deisty and her Opticos team, and just a few points that the commissioners may wish to consider about this document. My understanding is these guidelines will affect very few projects out of the total number, and they are discretionary. As Ms. Deisty pointed out, they are not required. So in this interest of simplifying the document, which the consultants have done a good job of, I suggest that the document recommend only one and detail only one style, that which is most commonly associated with Santa Barbara, Spanish colonial revival, Mediterranean, The document can even refer to the shelf full of existing documents, such as the guide to the El Pueblo Viejo, the history of Santa Barbara planning by Sheila Lodge, and other documents by David Gebhard. The viability of a document like this is based on its simplicity, its viability, and long-term implementation are how well it can be understood and simply that it can be applied. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do not have any more raised hands, so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back to the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Barza. And I would like to take a moment to thank our public speakers here today, Mr. Sweeney, Mr. Bolin, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Whelan. Thank you for taking time out of your day to speak to us, likely in addition to all of the written correspondence that we received. It's always nice to have in person and live voices speaking to us as well. Before I open this up to my colleagues, I want to take a moment to thank Ms. Deisty and your city staff group, all of you for being here today. Thank you to Opticos team for being here as well. This is a very large endeavor, and I know that you didn't start this yesterday. It's been a long time coming, and we're very excited. At least I believe I'm speaking on behalf of all of us when I say I'm very excited to have you here and to be able to review this document. It's beautiful. So to address my colleagues here, I want to just take a moment to explain how we have decided the process to proceed today. We are going to do sort of a two-part question period. You're welcome to deliberate in that period. If you have comments, go ahead and speak both questions and comments during this time. We are going to start with sort of an open question period for general questions. Think big, focus on big general questions like what you hope to see when staff comes back, perhaps what you believe we want or need to know, to ask them to return to us for us to have what we need to move forward with recommendations to staff. Secondly, I would like to do our best to keep this separate into two parts. So part two will be staff's guided questions, and Ms. Deisty will put those questions back up on the screen. I will let you turn on your buttons, and I'll call you in whatever order you pop up on my screen. But we'll go through those 4 questions, and you'll have a chance to address each one of those. Please don't worry if you are talking about those questions as part of your part 1 open question time. It's no problem at all. We may have you repeat for the purpose of taking notes and staying organized. But we're doing our best to provide Ms. Deisty and her team with the best feedback to help push this process along and hope for the most up-to-date, full of our questions and our feedback when she returns. So thank you very much for your patience as I try to organize this. And when you are ready, you can go ahead and turn on your buttons. I see Commissioner Wiscombe in the lead. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we're doing questions and comments at the same time on this before we go to the questions, Ms. Deisty's questions. Okay, great. I like that system. I was actually going to ask if we could do that. There's been a lot of confusion about using form-based codes. And so I guess my question is for benefit of the public and those of us that were very surprised that this document is a form-based code document. I just were there alternatives considered or are there no alternatives? Is this the best way to go? I think part of what I've heard today is that we really need to emphasize that this is for clean sites. We don't have a lot of those in the city. So, and I gather if we demo something, if a developer demos something and the site's vacant, then you go to this system if they want to. So, okay. But were there alternatives considered to form-based codes, or is that kind of the norm? Yeah, that would be for Mr. Pellegrini.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I would say that we absolutely carry that expertise in form-based codes, and we tend to see things through that lens. with these requirements for objective standards that the state has created, we determine in almost every case that it actually is, it makes the most sense. It's the most sort of practical approach to organizing objective standards in a way that they can be measurable and defensible. And that sort of is reflected in this product. I think having said that, we had to go through a lot of decisions with staff about a lot of content that the city has, which is currently not objective, but it is used in that way because there are sort of guidelines that are presented that over the years have been adhered to very successfully. And so we needed to sort of think about how to sort of convert those things through that lens and see them sort of through that objective standards lens. So I think I'm hoping I'm answering your question here.
Yes, you are. Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Okay, and there are lots of things, just as a comment, in this document that I know Mr. Sweeney has been before us before, and we've talked to him about the little building next to the big tall building and how's that handled. And I think you've done a commendable job of handling those types of situations in here. At least he didn't bring it up today, so he's giving me a thumbs up. Okay. So just, I think, Ms. Deisty, this is probably for you. Doesn't this document have a greater impact to changes in Title 30? I know we've been talking about changes in Title 30 for a while. So first of all, do we have a schedule for Title 30 revisions? And also, will this document increase the number of revisions in Title 30? Mr. Gullett.
Good afternoon, commissioners. We are very excited to be here with this document. I'll introduce myself. The chair asked me to introduce myself. I'm Dan Gullett, principal planner, interim city planner, and I've worked with Rosie and the team on this from the beginning. And this is it's a paradigm shift. It's a very new way of doing things. We kind of have to do this, but we really want to do this as well. Your question about Title 30 amendments, we're down 2 key staff members, so it's taking longer than we want. We are actively drafting those. We anticipate being at the Planning Commission before the end of the year with those, and this is a massive document. It's 5 years worth of amendments that have kind of piled up, and moving forward, we want to pace ourselves better and have the Planning Commission and City Council know what to expect and the timelines to expect those things to be delivered into the future. So I don't have a hard date. Unfortunately, our housing element is still in progress. We got another letter from the state that we're responding to earlier this month. So our resources are appropriately focused there right now as we move these other things along as we can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, and you're doing a good job of that. So, Mr. Gullett, stay up there a minute, because this is where, since I can comment on this is where I'm going to go with this. There's a lot of references to Title 30 in this document that go to the title, the chapter, and then the verse, or whatever you call the third thing, the third group of numbers. And I'm thinking that it might be helpful to remove those, the third group. And so you just get the applicant who's using this process to the title and then the chapter. And then they can find the reference in there. And the only reason I say that is because I think we might have a lot of numerical changes which would affect this document. So I'm thinking that that might be a really good approach to, and I can give you here's a specific example on pages 36 and 37 of the actual document, 35, 36.
Oh, to the staff report.
No, I'm in the document, sorry. Yeah, I'm telling you it's the document, but I'm in the staff report. Okay, yeah, here, community benefit project defined, da-da-da-da-da. Here's something, C section, this is on 36, C section 25.03.030, oh no, that's 25, no, I'm sorry. Requirement, and 30.140.170 for solar access height limitations. And instead of saying that section, say chapter 30.140 and stop it there and just call out solar height limitations. And I could go on, the next one would be on the next page, 37. You have a reference, see section 30.185.265 mixed-use projects. So just see chapter 30.185 mixed-use projects. And then that way, if there's a lot of numerical changes to Title 30, they won't affect this document.
Commissioner Wiscombe, I really like that recommendation. We'll take it under advisement if we can do it. I think it's wise to do that. Otherwise, we're changing them both into the future.
Yeah, it's just, having been a spec writer and a plan drawer, you never repeat your stuff, because then you got to change it in 2 places instead of 1. So, yeah, so I just thought that might be a cleaner way, since we don't really have a date on Title 30 yet. So, okay, let me see if I have any more questions. Since you're up here, Mr. Gullett, I'll see. Review procedures. This is probably for Ms. Deisty, I guess. So I'm skipping around here. I'm sorry. I think, yeah.
I'm happy to come back up.
Yeah, okay. Okay. You talk about page 31 of 50, so this is your staff report. Oh, no, this is a comment in response 11A. The specific review procedures for ODDS projects are under development by staff. And I'm just asking, have you actually developed those procedures yet? And are they in here? Because I couldn't find them if you have.
Yes, Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Wiscombe. So the review procedures will be in Title 30, kind of like all our common procedures for review are in there. So there is something drafted, but you haven't seen it yet. It's something we're still discussing as staff, the details of which, and also need legal review still. So that's why it's not part of your packet right now, but you will be seeing it.
Okay, and then that will be referenced in this ODDS document. I hate to call it odds.
I know.
Yeah. Sound right, so I'm going to call it ODDS document.
Yeah, similar to other places where we need to do cross-references, that would be a similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, and then this is very specific. No, I figured that out, never mind. You have on page 11 of the document, you talk about rules for construction of language references, and I had no idea what that was, so I had to go and find that, which you do reference. You do reference the section in Title 30, so I found out what that meant. That's okay. And then, okay, on page 17 of the document, go to the document again. Oh, okay. I'm looking at the on-site parking, and this is very specific question, so I am jumping around. I apologize for that. Number 5, primary front access is not allowed on corner design sites except where secondary front access can be approved by the Public Works Director as an exception due to safety. I don't understand what that means. I read that like 4 times, and I still don't get it.
Okay, Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Wiscombe. Let's see. So we did talk about this one with our transportation planning staff, and it's to do with access to the site, your primary
Right.
driveway. And they, let's see, if there's a corner design site, they prefer the access to be on the secondary.
Yeah, we had a
Street.
project like that on Shoreline Drive recently, yes.
Correct.
And the driveway did get moved to the secondary street from
And
the
it's to
primary.
do with traffic patterns and
Yes.
backing in and out
Yeah.
of the street. So that's what this is referring to. It does give a option, though, to have it different if they look at the site and say, no, it'd be better to be over here instead. So that's what that's referring
So
to.
except where secondary front access, which would be the side street, right? Secondary front access.
Yeah.
Can be approved by the public, that's what got me, can be approved by the Public Works Director as an exception. You want it to be, you want the secondary street to be the access. So this didn't make sense to me, except where secondary front access can be approved. Don't you want it approved?
Yeah, I see, now that you pointed out the sentence, yeah, we need to adjust that
Okay.
sentence.
That's just to fix me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, and then, is there any intention of bringing this product back after it's been here today? It's coming back to us again. It seems to me that it's beneficial to bring this back to HLC and ABR since they're the ones that will be using it. Are you planning on doing that, or can we request that? I know that's extra time in meetings, but, maybe just staff, not consultant, because you're probably not in the consultant contract to do that, but.
Yeah, so Chair Brunderson and Commissioner Wiscombe, it certainly could be done if that's something that's recommended. I would prefer to speak to the design review supervisor and get her opinion as well. She's on vacation right now. The only thing is, we were hoping that if we go to the work group, who has the members of those two bodies, and work out the details there, and they report back to ABR and HLC, I think it's more efficient. The problem with going to those design review bodies is their agendas are really, really full. And when we have gotten to them, we've been limited to half hour, and we've gone overtime, and it's still not enough to give a little presentation and get their input that's been very meaningful. So that's been the limitation, is just
Okay.
trying to get
Yeah.
on their agendas and have an efficient meeting that gets really good input. But we do get good input from the work group members, so we were hoping that would be more efficient and better use of time.
Okay, that's fair. I just think there's some members of the work group, I think, are, perhaps not as happy with this document, and that, are on those boards and commissions. So it just would be, it would be good to get, kind of fully on board. So, okay, that's good. Okay, and then I was just curious, general site design standards, which are chapter 3, this would be, is it Pellegrini, is that right? Yeah, Mr. Pellegrini, this I guess would be for you, which are chapter 3, and frontages, chapter 5. Can we consolidate these into one chapter, or, the only reason I'm asking, this is a really cumbersome document, and I think the more we can kind of consolidate chapters and, where you don't have to jump from one to another would be a good thing. So that was just one suggestion I had, maybe worth looking at. I'll just leave it as a comment. And then Mr. Johnson, Steve Johnson, brought up the bank. That is definitely, I looked up the code, it definitely is objective, not subject. I mean, it definitely is subjective, not objective. So that's something that we could add to the fix-it list, maybe?
Would you like me to respond a little bit to that?
Yes, if you could. I mean, it was clear to me in the code that the community development director makes the decision.
Yeah, Chair
And-
Bonderson, yeah, and Commissioner Wiscombe. I think it's worth giving just a little bit of background on that, too, is that as you know from your work on the coastal land use plan, we have really good objective creek setbacks and top of bank definitions and ways of measuring in that document, but we haven't had staff yet to do the same effort inland. But it's something we do intend to do. In fact, it's called out in the housing element as a future program that we need to have measurable creek setbacks and objective top-of-bank definitions created for the inland areas of the city. So this was seen, what you see before you in the document here is sort of a stopgap until that happens for the inland areas. It's the same standards we adopted when we adopted Senate Bill 9 amendments to the zoning ordinance, which were adopted in that exact same language by City Council. So with the 35-foot creek setbacks and still using the top-of-bank measurement method that's in Title 30. But again, we see it as a stopgap until something's adopted for the inland areas.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just think it's important that, since this is ODDS, that we don't have references in there that are subjective. So, okay. And then, let's see. A lot of the comments made by, I think both committee members and the public was, they'd like an executive summary. Maybe which we don't really have in here, but maybe an executive summary of just highlighting the chapters as you did today, Mr. Pellegrini. That might be important so people know where to go and get certain information, if that can be done. It would be very difficult, I think, to do an executive summary of what goes on other than maybe where you find things.
Yes, we did get that comment, and because this is a chapter of the municipal code, an executive summary isn't necessarily
right.
appropriate within this document, but we do see, we've heard that, and it could be something we create as a handout. We put it on the website.
Okay.
We'll find a way to have that summary in the applicant handout, something like that.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think that's important. A handout might be good. Get people familiar with it. And then, Ms. Dicey, you had a table. Oh no, it's been included. Never mind. The table you had in the staff report on page 6. That's in the. That's a more detailed version of that's actually in here early on in the. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I talked about that. And I like the palette of 5 zones, that slide that you showed. I thought that was really good in the standards. I think that's an appropriate palette for a document like this. And just to reiterate, I appreciate the attention to the transitions. I think that's important. With Pat Saley's memo, which Mr. Sweeney supports, I didn't really get a chance to, I'd really like to kind of see those areas. I think the point about Milpas and having some public input on Milpas might be important before you go the 3-style route. And also, the major entry points definitely need to be the Mediterranean style, and mountain views that Mr. Sweeney talked about. Not that familiar with the De La Vina one that Pat Saley talked about in the memo, but I think that's worthy of looking at that too.
Commissioner Wiscombe, I just want to step in and gently remind you, some of those questions are in the Part 2 questions. For example, what you just discussed, I'd love to keep you in that part.
Oh, well, okay,
Do you think you have any other questions that
No,
don't cover-
I'm done. I was actually responding more to what Mr.
the
Sweeney
commenter.
said and what we got as a handout from the email we got from Pat Saley in addition to the email we got from Steve Johnson and what Mr. Sweeney said here. That's what I was really responding to. I wasn't paying any attention to the question. So
Sir, don't-
I'm done, thank you.
And please don't worry, you can go ahead and talk about that again during the second part of the questions if it comes up, okay? I think it fits. Is there anyone who'd like to speak next? If not, I can go, so any takers? Okay, Commissioner Lodge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm still not clear on just what kind of project this huge effort is being created, or is created, a 250-page approximately document, while the city hasn't received any projects that would be covered by it yet. So could you clarify for me just what it does this will apply to?
Yes, Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Lodge. So again, we did touch on state laws that require objective design standards. I did touch on Senate Bill 35, and there is something new on that bill that was not in your staff report at the time. I wrote the staff report, a project had to have 50% affordable units to qualify for Senate Bill 35, but the state has they go through a cycle and they look at all the jurisdictions and give them new designations. And so we're now in the 10% affordability category, and it'll be that way for the next 4 years at least until they redo it. So that might mean we haven't received Senate Bill 35 projects yet, but it's way more likely now that someone may say, I just want to be reviewed per Senate Bill 35 and objective standards. So that's one thing. There's also new state laws out there that are providing a more streamlined process and more by right processing for projects that comply with objective standards. So just because we haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it won't happen soon. Also, it could be, we often see projects that assemble lots, demolish everything, and build new apartments. We've seen that throughout downtown, so this could be applicable to those projects. It also could spur, I don't want to speculate too much, but having this available in the what we call neighborhood medium, but is the R2 zone district, which doesn't see a lot of development now. Having this available might spur a little more projects with duplexes going in, or they may have an existing building and put in another duplex. And that would be a good use of this product because those neighborhoods have been kind of stagnant for a while. So I could see them being used throughout the city in those circumstances.
Okay, that would be in addition to the bill which allows putting essentially 4 units where now there's a single family.
Well, to clarify though, this, the odds do not apply to single unit zoning. So,
Well,
yeah. So if
Okay.
the site's already zoned single unit, it wouldn't be used.
Okay. Oh, and I wondered why there is open yard, but common open yard in here, but why no private open yard is recommended in this? And perhaps that's a question for Opticos.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner Lodge. The approach, I'll answer what the general approach was simple and very short, and then we can expand on that. The approach is that Santa Barbara has such great public realm, great places to walk along and to, that we advise the city to go with an open yard requirement for overall for the project, for a building, but that private spaces, say patios, decks, balconies, other individual spaces for units weren't really necessary given the type of efficiencies that are trying to be achieved with these types of projects. And so we advise the city that, yeah, you could require those, and you currently do, But in these cases, we recommended that it not be required for those reasons.
Well, I'm really concerned about livability in these units, and I think they make a huge difference. You can just step outside and see what the weather feels like or whatever without having to get dressed and
Yeah.
go downstairs and all of that outside. So I would like to see them back in.
We don't disagree with you at all. Yeah, it just in terms of trying to make more, yeah, so it's certainly.
Okay. And then why the 14-foot minimum first floor height? We've had projects coming in that are less than that, and it increases the bulk of the building.
Thanks, Commissioner Lodge. I would say that the 14-foot is a recommendation for the zone district where that is anticipating buildings that are 45 feet tall. And the idea there, and this is a nuance and open to discussion, but that in a 45-foot tall building, it actually benefits to have a slightly taller ground floor for the overall proportion of the building. And this would differ in the other zones that are anticipating shorter buildings where the first floor ceiling height is typically 12. And so again, there's absolutely some opportunity for discussion here, but our recommendation there was tied to getting a better proportion in the zones where taller buildings were allowed.
Commissioner Lodge, would you mind if I build on
No,
that question?
go ahead.
Just to be clear, when you're referring to these zones for the taller buildings to be allowed, are you by any chance referring to the possibility of mixed use, meaning more public spaces on that first floor, not residential? Could you maybe build on that
Correct.
concept?
Yeah, I think the reference that we received in the comments was for the mixed-use corridor zone. And that is anticipating mixed-use environments where there are ground floor retail or services with residential above.
Thank you. That wasn't exactly clear with your initial response. And
Thank
just
you.
to build on that, the alternate areas where you mentioned 12, would those be then residential? Those would be in other areas of town where the first floor may be residential, and you're recommending 12 feet for that initial ground level?
Correct. Some of the zones where there is that flexibility expected, where either residential or non-residential uses can occur, the code actually stipulates the expected heights for each of those uses, and it describes them differently. But yes, in zones where actually shorter buildings are anticipated, it actually generally goes with 12 for the mixed use. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, Commissioner Lodge, I just wanted to go back to your private open space question. There was a portion that I forgot to mention. One of the reasons that we advise the city not to require it is that especially on house scale buildings, say under 3 stories or even 3 stories and under that, and 80 feet or less in length. There's nothing totally scientific about that, but that generally tends to be where house scale ends. So buildings that are of that size and less, it becomes really difficult in objective standards to say how many balconies to put on, how many not to put on. And at some point when somebody says, well, every unit gets a balcony or a patio, what used to look like a house scale building that fit in nicely into a house scale environment, lower intensity, all of a sudden becomes a very visually busy building. And for that reason, we recommend on those smaller buildings to not require the private open space. Could it be required of bigger ones? Yes. But it's at that smaller scale particularly that we found it difficult to advise them to require it.
Okay, thank you. And then I couldn't go back, and I wasn't able to find this by going back through the document, but I gather that the work group suggested the contemporary style, saying something to the effect of, well, it's already here, we should, we already have contemporary buildings, there should be a style for it. Where did that come from?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Lodge, Early on in this project, and we were discussing different architectural styles, some of the work group members felt that we see contemporary buildings, but we don't have a lot of guidance for them, and it would be nice to have that. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a unanimous opinion, but that definitely came up as one of the topics, and we have seen some of our newer, bigger projects constructed under the average unit size density incentive program in that contemporary style. And so we felt like if developers want to build in that style, we should have some good standards for it. And some people do like the contemporary style and feel like it fits into Santa Barbara. It can be a little less expensive sometimes to build as well, so maybe it's a trade-off to get more units built in that style. So that was, and also because, as Opticos mentioned, they did document it as one of the styles that we see in our city. So that was the sort of genesis of including that style group.
Okay, well, I think those are my questions for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Boss is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think my first question is around community engagement, and I know you had a slide on this, but I'm wondering if you can speak more to neighborhood-specific community engagement, so especially outside of the El Pueblo Viejo neighborhood, and then any community engagement with affordable housing advocates, and the staff report mentioned community members, social and environmental justice advocates. So can you speak to those specific groups?
Certainly, Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Boss. So, yeah, you did send that question about which groups specifically did we talk to. That was to do with the stakeholder interviews that Opticos conducted. So the affordable housing advocate groups we spoke to were members of the City Housing Authority and People's Self-Help Housing. And then we did speak to one member of Santa Barbara County Action Network as sort of the advocate person. So that was part of that outreach, again, that also included architects, designers, developers, landscape architects, I believe. So that was part of that engagement early on. Again, we haven't, I wouldn't say we've gone specifically out to particular neighborhoods and talked to neighborhood groups. This project, again, had a long public engagement process, and it's been available on the website, and we've, tried to broadcast meetings or have people come to the work group meetings. They haven't been that well attended, and some of the limitations have just been staff time, spread thin, and it takes a lot of time to go neighborhood by neighborhood engagement. But again, some people have mentioned maybe some specific outreach to Milpas Street. That seems like a good idea to get their input on the styles. And we'd be happy to continue that outreach as much as we can within our time limits.
Thank you. And I think it's LEAP funded, so it's through
Correct.
September. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So to build a little bit more on the community engagement, I think it would be really helpful to East Side and West Side, especially to have that neighborhood engagement. You mentioned the survey was mostly homeowners, and there are certainly homeowners in those areas, but also a lot of renters. So I think that would be really beneficial.
Okay.
Another question about the different styles, and I think it was in response to some of the public comment about there are a number of styles in the city, but there were budget limitations and practical concerns, so it lists the most prevalent styles. Is most prevalent objectively defined, so is there a specific number or percentage?
Thank you, Commissioner Boss. There is an objective answer to that question, but I will say that in instances where we saw just, for example, one example of a style within a neighborhood, one or two examples, we noted that. If we saw typically 3 or more examples per block, then it sort of became something that was prevalent.
Thank you. Some other questions just related to some of the legislation. So with SB 330, when it's, eliminating delays and limits the number of meetings, I think my understanding is that our charter requires ABR and HLC. So would any of these projects, would they be on a consent agenda, or would they still require a presentation and discussion to those bodies?
Commissioner Boss, again, we're still working out the process, but we intend to bring these projects to the full board rather than consent for several different reasons, one of which would be it's a lot of pressure on just the consent reviewer to be the one potentially approving could be a fairly large and complex project. And we also wanted the opportunity of the full board gives maybe the public a little more opportunity to at least hear what the project is about. They probably have limited ability to change the project, but at least they can have the benefit of a staff report and learn a little bit more about the project. So at this time, we're thinking of not doing consent, but full board for these projects.
Great, thank you. And there was also a note about 221 sites in the suitable sites inventory and the housing element update qualified for use by right, but I didn't see that noted in the suitable sites inventory. Was that added and I missed it?
Commissioner Boss, so the sites inventory that's within the housing element is essentially a big PDF that's part of a larger spreadsheet. So we have, if you have the full spreadsheet, it shows you what she's referring to are sites that were also in the 4th and 5th cycles and have still not been developed for housing. We also have an online map of the suitable sites inventory. I didn't check it today, but I'm pretty sure if you click on a site in the map, it'll tell you if it was in a prior cycle. So then you know which sites are subject to that use by right.
Great, thank you. Couple more questions. I think it was in some of the working group discussions, a little bit about the lots having odd shapes rather than simple rectangles and squares. And I'm just curious, it feels to me, as just somebody walking around the city, that a lot of the lots are more odd. Is there a specific number, percentage, or is that just me?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Boss, so most of the lots in our sort of grid system of the city or the downtown core and surrounding areas are fairly uniform. They do tend to be sometimes long and narrow, but we find that most of the odd-shaped lots would be in the hillside areas or where you start, getting some topography. And so I think the way and maybe Opticos can describe the design site boundaries a little better, but I think it's not going to be too much of a problem to accommodate odd-shaped lots.
Great, thank you. And my last question is about the community benefits project definitions and standards. There was a note about those being developed or updated separately. What's the timeline or process for that?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Boss, that's tied in with the Title 30 amendments that Mr. Gullett mentioned earlier, so it's under that timeline. I think he mentioned hopefully before the end of the year.
Great, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Boss. Next, we have Commissioner Wardlow, please.
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. Thank you all for the presentation. This was really helpful. I commend and agree with a lot of the comments made by Commissioner Lodge and Commissioner Boss. I have a couple questions just as in relation specifically to the maps and how they apply in Milpas, on Milpas. So first, I'm seeing that there's, throughout Milpas, we're looking at 3 different types of architectural standards. So, in lower Milpas, we're fine with all 3 categories that were provided. In middle Milpas, we have 2, and then in middle Milpas, we have only Mediterranean, and then in upper Milpas, we have both Mediterranean and Craftsman. So is this consistent or aligned with the plan that was provided that Mr. Sweeney noted that had been developed 40 years ago? The idea of having all this kind of variety on Milpas in terms of the differences of the types of architectural style?
I'm sorry, I was looking for the slide with the architectural styles map. Could you repeat the last part of that again?
Just is the differences on Milpas. So Milpas has 3 different colored zones, so allowing for 3 different types of architectural styles. Is that consistent with what 40 years ago we had wanted on Milpas, or was it just that we only wanted, the Mediterranean, or we only wanted?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do have a slide actually that can, might help with that in these extra slides. And this was actually, Commissioner Bauke brought this up and provided this picture, which shows you how we're looking at it now. It doesn't show all of Milpas, but it shows a portion of it. But I do have a slide. This is in reference to the Haley Milpas design guidelines, or design manual, sorry. And the way they divided Milpas up in this manual was the orange portion was in the Hispanic Pueblo. I don't think they called it a style, but they called it a, I forget the word for it. But anyway, and then the rest of it was designated as industrial. So when we saw this guidance from, sorry, it's a design district. So when we saw this reference in this Haley Milpas design manual, we matched our style recommendations to what was here. That doesn't mean it has to stay that way, because this is just a fairly old document, and it would be great to hear some more input from people who live in that area or have businesses in that area, but that's what we tried to match.
Okay, great. I definitely agree with Commissioner Boss's points on, really engaging those local neighborhood associations and kind of working with them to make sure they're aware of this and get their feedback. When we're limiting the types of architecture, and I apologize if this is kind of a sillier question, I'm just not as familiar with this, but when we limit the types of permissible architecture to 3 instead of, the 9 or whatever that were noted here, what is the purpose of that? Is it that we're worried that if we don't specify only these 3, that they'll only do one of them, or that they'll only pursue an option that we don't want? Like, if we're trying to promote diversity of different types of buildings, wouldn't we allow, a number of them, like, the industrial kind of look that we're already looking at on Lower Milpas for the Tri-County Produce Project?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Wardlow, I'll start that and see if Opticos wants to chime in. But first, I want to point out that if somebody wants to do a style that's not in the objective design standards, they're entirely welcome to do that. They just won't be using this document. They'll go through, use our design guidelines and go through normal design review. This project was funded by a grant, and we were, as you can see from the chapter 6 it is, I believe, how detailed it is. To do that much detail for, 5 or 6 more styles was just out of our budget and time frame. So when we knew we needed to narrow it down, with Opticos' advice, we looked at the most prevalent styles and knew that some areas already have this style guidance, like they require Spanish colonial revival or that similar Mediterranean style group. So we started there and then branched out to the other 2 style groups. Could be a future effort to add more styles if funding becomes available and staff is available to do it, but we wanted to start here. I
That
don't know
totally
if you
makes
want to add
sense.
anything.
That was helpful. So in the context of the project that we're looking at on Lower Milpas, this would just be an example where they wouldn't utilize this. Is that the case? Like, they wouldn't utilize this as the way in which they'd go about their development?
Yeah, Chair Bonderson and Commissioner Wardlow. I'm not all that familiar with the project you're referring to, but yeah.
Okay, so if it was a different style, then it's just like what you said, they use a different process. They just
Correct.
don't use this. Okay, great. Okay, that's the remainder of my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. Next, we have Commissioner DeLuccio, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Sweeney, and all the public that has participated in this. I think it's almost there, and I have to commend staff, obviously, that you guys have such a load on your plate, and also the consulting group. I'm glad you were chosen since you do have experience with this. Does the grant, I guess, expires at the end of the year? Does that mean that this needs to be adopted by then?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner DeLuccio, our understanding with the grant is we need to have the final invoices from our consultant in by the end of the year. But if it ends up taking a little more time, let's say we just haven't been able to get to adoption, staff would be able to just carry it forward towards adoption. But we will have our time finished with our consultant
Okay.
at that point.
I do think it needs a little more input from the public, a larger radius of the public of Santa Barbara, especially on Melpis Street. I think that needs a little attention. I actually live on Upper De La Vina Street, by the way, so that is an up-and-coming little corridor over there. And then let's not lose sight of the sea level rise. I thought the speakers spoke very well about that. Is that being addressed as part of this document, or will it be relooked a little bit?
Chair Bonderson and Commissioner DiLucio, we actually have a separate effort. There's a sea level rise adaptation plan that the city's Sustainability and Resilience Department is in charge of. And I believe that effort is looking at all areas of the city subject to sea level rise and coming up with how the city's going to adapt. So it's not really appropriate to be part of this document.
Okay,
We have
great.
a separate effort.
As long as we noted that, I think that's important. It's interesting about heights that did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I could, Commissioner DeLucio. So sea
The
level
chair will
rise.
allow you to.
Madam Chair, thank you. So we have a newer coastal land use plan. It was adopted in 2019 that has policies regarding sea level rise. So most of the parcels that are affected, at least in the near term, are in the coastal zone. They would need a coastal development permit and would be reviewed for effects of sea level rise on those parcels.
Thank you for that further clarification. Then we talk about heights, and I know that in some areas, the height could be, is it 45 feet, I guess, in some of the mixed commercial areas? I guess which Commissioner Lodge was alluding to, sometimes when you have a 45-foot height, it actually be in the higher ceilings. Actually, what happens is it doesn't become a 45 or 48 is what the limit could be. Then they're going to come before us, for example, saying they need 51 feet or 50 or 55 feet. I don't know if it's gone that high. So that's the only call out that I want to make about that. I'm not necessarily opposed to higher heights sometimes, but I think that's what happens as when you allow the higher ceilings and then they'll come before us and need more height. I guess the question's already been answered about the why it doesn't require the private open yards, and I understand that. Do these type of projects, will they have more common open areas?
Yes, thanks for the question, Commissioner DeLucio. Yes, so the smaller the building, the larger, there's a requirement for on-site, what we call open yard, using your term, the city's term. But the bigger buildings, the block scale buildings in the downtown core, do not require open yard because they're using more of the lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And I also tend to agree that maybe the working group members, if it can go before them another time, I think, instead of because I feel like we need to find closure on this at some point. And you guys you're so involved with the housing element in the general plan. That seems to keep coming back. You've done tremendous work on that, and you're short of staff, and you have this project, and it'd be nice to maybe adopt this. And the question becomes, once it becomes adopted, the consultant can maybe answer this. You guys seem to be experts at this, and you've done other plans. Do you think this will become more common in the future versus the conventional document we have, Title 30? More people will start using it. I know right now it's mandatory is why we're doing this, but do you think this will be the way of the future a little more so?
Thank you, Commissioner DeLucio. I think there are several trends which are pointing towards continual support of streamlining housing approvals, which will make these tools, if we follow past and current trends, these tools will only become more important.
Okay. I just have a couple more comments. I do like the standard design standards. I like the way it's going to be more laid out where we're all concerned about the historic resources of the city and how they will be, I hate to use the word compatibility. It seems like compatibility is more the conventional way, but how we respect the historic buildings with the way we will be building out the new buildings. And I also like the community open spaces. I think it's really cool about having, for the larger projects, to have 10% set aside for public open space. I think that's really, really important. So those are my comments for now. I guess, Chair, we'll be going over the other questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we will have more time to address anything that may be outstanding. Commissioner, Vice Chair Balke, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Stefan and Tony, long time to see you in person. Just for full disclosure, I've known these two for multiple decades and worked with them personally, so.
But
it's
never
cool.
met them in
What?
person. But never met them in person.
No, it's been a while because of COVID, things, Zoom calls and things like that, but it's nice to see them in person. I've got a whole bunch of comments, probably sort of an intro, and then some details, and then some procedural questions as we go forward. The first one is sort of for the general public to understand why this needs to be done, which is the state of California is definitely declaring an attack on our design process through its legislation, take it as it may, but to ensure that the community continues to have architecture at the standards that Santa Barbara's are used to. This is a document that will be what we have to defend ourselves. Unfortunately, the discretionary process that's even in our charter, which Commissioner Lodge can talk at length about, is under attack just purely from the state legislature because of lack of production of housing. And because of that, we need to clearly define what is acceptable from a design standpoint for our community. And because of that, and from my experience, unless you do that in a very, very detailed way, you cannot expect the development community and the building community to actually create quality housing. That is not their business model. Their business model is to do as least as possible to make as much profit in return. So, this is where the friction is between the public realm and what we see out in community is what we're so proud of and what the economic forces lay before us. So I've heard from my members of the working group efforts and desires to make them less detailed and more guidelines and such. That is the wrong way to go. As a person who's actually been in front of a judge with a city trying to defend form-based codes, the more detail and more prescriptive, the better you are at defending these against legal attacks by the development community. So for those reasons, I'm very, very happy that the city picked Opticos because there's a few firms that do this work that are at this level, and they're one of the best. And and you can see that from the product that you have. Unfortunately, the budget's not quite what I would hope that you would have because there are a number of styles that we sort of dropped off the table. May they be Italianate or a couple others that are in the list that are part of the DNA of the building fabric of this community, but we only have so much. Contemporary is a architectural style which does exist in this community, but I think there were some members of the working group that really pushed that, and I really think that's one that we as a commission and a community might want to consider either A, removing from a possibility through this process, or limit it to the extent feasible. It is not something I find appropriate, and I'd like Rosie to put up, we actually have this map, but the map that I had, but there are places in which currently we have other standards, like the design districts that were on the Milpas, Haley corridor. And the question is, and we've had examples of modern buildings showing up in these areas. We just had recently one which was approved on a 3-2 vote by the Architectural Review Board at 401 East Haley, which I'm not sure we green, just like we saw for the 76-unit project that was on North Milpas at 701, in which caused such an uproar that was redesigned, and a development agreement came forward to basically quell the community's concern. I fully expect us to hear a lot of feedback on this one coming forward and probably an appeal. These are both what developers will do if it's an option for them to do. And the reason for that is very clear. It is cheaper to do, and cheaper does not necessarily mean contextual to the community. So those areas, especially these two areas, basically the Haley Corridor and Milpas in the entrances and exits to our city, I think we really need to think very hard on whether we allow contemporary in them at all. There are other areas which contemporary I think is appropriate, such as La Cumbre Plaza. It's an area in which we've already got a number of contemporary buildings like the Mark and others out there, and to have a contemporary feel would be appropriate up there. So that's sort of my big picture, general commentary more than questions. I do have some questions as to how we came to decisions on a couple particular areas. And if we could, well, first off is the area that we have before us. One on architecture, but also on the land use of whether this should be in the next level up as far as intensity. Right now we have it as the mixed use corridor, and whether it should be the higher one, I forgot what it is off the top of my head, the downtown edge. That needs to be part of that conversation, I think, with the community that we were discussing, because we've approved some projects like the one that we did, the development agreement based 701 Milpas would be more, in my mind, one that would fit that the neighborhood, the core edge type of project. So if we're going to approve projects like that, that fit that type of intensity, we should be clear that if that's what we want, that's what we should have here. So there shouldn't be inconsistencies between the kind of things we're approving and through the regular process and what's in this ODS process. The other two areas that I had concern is it was basically the Haley Corridor, the Milpas Corridor, and why up in the Mesa you have the north side, we'll call it north side of the street being in the mixed-use corridor, but the south side of Cliff not. You would think those two would be the same.
That's a question.
That was a question. I was wondering why they weren't, and why one side was mixed-use corridor and one was not.
Commissioner Balke, or Vice Chair Balke, regarding the Mesa, I believe the north side of Cliff Drive is mixed-use corridor, and then below that is neighborhood large. And what we did when we looked at this map carefully and made some recommendations, we looked at the underlying zoning. So I believe it's based on the underlying zoning, which I don't have memorized in my head right now, but I could come back to you with more detail.
Okay, thank you. Now, questions I had, and there's some detailed ones, and I'll go to sort of one of the big picture ones, which is we have the large site standards, and the first question is, would these large site standards, and this is a concern I have, apply to La Cumbre Plaza?
Commissioner Bonderson and Vice Chair Balke, they could apply to La Cumbre Plaza, correct, if the developer chose to use them.
Yeah, because I could see a future of that coming about if they decided to pull the developer's remedy card on that project. In light of that, there's provisions in the block size requirements for the large lot development or large area development. First question is, why did we pick 3 acres?
Vice Chair Bauke, we started with, I believe, is it 5 acres? Yeah, for the, I mentioned Opticos did a Marin County toolkit, and their large site standard started at 5 acres, which made sense to us in Marin County, which has a lot of large vacant areas still. We looked at our city and felt like 3 acres was a little bit more reflective of what we might see in our city if either something like La Cumbre Plaza or people merging lots and assembling larger sites. But we really don't expect this to be used often. It would be a rare instance.
Right. I was just wondering if consideration of going to like 2 acres would have been appropriate.
Yeah, Vice Chair Bauke, just adding to that, yeah, if you're asking, should the threshold be 2, and the answer is, at what point do you want to compel a larger site to become new blocks and new streets, whether they're public or private? And that answer is totally local. And so 3 acres we found was a good number, a good balance. But if you're saying, if you think there are other sites that might be assembled to become a 2-acre project or that project, 2 acres is a better threshold, then yeah, you're going to catch even more. That's really a key question to ask for that standard. The main thing that those standards are trying to do is keep superblocks from happening or break up superblocks that exist.
Right, and that's one of the questions that I was going to lead to next, which is you have a 1,800 linear feet perimeter, and I was wondering why you picked 1,800 when I would think 1,600 or less would be more appropriate based on Santa Barbara's grid size.
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner Chair Bauke, Vice Chair Bauke, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it, I don't care.
Well, I see everybody's using the titles, and we're trying to be, anyway, so, yeah, 1,800, I don't remember the science behind 1,800 versus why we didn't go with 1,600, which is more typical of Santa Barbara. I'd have to look at our analysis and find out why we chose that.
Okay.
We can get back to staff on that.
Back to a commentary, smaller is better. And from walkability standpoint, and just a livability standpoint. So, basically, the more network you can create for pedestrians and the smaller the scale, the better we're all going to be in the long term. I noticed something that at least I couldn't find. It may be there, because the chances of them missing it are pretty low, is in the large block, there isn't a discussion about the frequency of breaking up the blocks with paseos. There wasn't, I didn't find, because sometimes there's usually like a 250 or so, or maybe 200 requirement in those standards to allow to break up the blocks with pedestrian access. I was wondering, is it in there, or did I miss it, or could we make sure it's in there?
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chair, for that question. The reason that you don't see it, well, it's in there, but it's in there as a way to break up a longer block. If somebody says, well, I don't want to do a block that turns out to be 400 or 500, I want to do a block that's 6 or 650, then at some point, I don't remember the number right now, but at some point then a mid-block passage would be required of that block. And so that's why you don't see it as a technique to break up every block. It's intended more when you have a longer block than the standards would otherwise allow.
Okay, yeah. I'm just used to having a standard set forth as, you can't go past X without breaking it up. And I would recommend that we add that so it's clear. Couple other ones, and I'm doing these off the top of my head, so I'm not shuffling through the paper. I notice in a number of areas, especially when we're talking about, basically shade structures, pergolas and things like that, that you use depictions of 4x4, 2x4, 8, basically what sounds and looks like lumber dimensions. And I want to make it very clear that it's not the lumber dimension, that we're actually talking actual size, because trust me, the folks in the development community would instantly think that you're talking the lumber dimensions in those cases. And I just want to make sure you articulate that's what you mean. If you want lumber dimensions, that's fine. Just say that's what it is, or if it's actual dimensions. Okay. I think I have a number of other comments, but they all sort of can be answered in the other process. And so, thank you much.
Thank you, Vice Chair Balke. Just being sensitive to time and making sure that we take a moment to have a health break, I think it would be best if I hold my questions and comments until after. And I'd like to give everyone about 10 minutes to get up and stretch their legs. I'll even round it up to 12 minutes. Would we be able to all be back in our seats at 3:20? That will be 14 minutes from now. Thank you very much. forward with our item number 3, and we will begin with my part 1 questions and deliberation. Then we will continue forward with the breakdown guided by Ms. Dieste with the questions on the screen. So to begin, I always appreciate acknowledging credit where credit is due, and I want to just take a moment and thank the members of the work group, specifically Vice Chair Bauke represents the Planning Commission, but I'd also like to thank Richard Six and David Black from ABR, Robert Uli, Dennis Dorden from HLC, and Cass Ensberg and Deddy Pikert from AIA. Their comments are in our staff report, and that was where I spent a lot of my time referencing and going back and forth, kind of playing the connect the dots game. Their comments addressed many of my personal comments, and so it was very helpful to include that in the staff report. So then again, I need to commend staff. Again, where credit is due, I like to give thanks. So I know it was not a single-handed effort, and it's been a big project for you, Ms. Dieste, and your team. So I just want to thank you all again. I want to begin with a comment. It's sort of been touched on. I'm not sure if it was addressed the way I want to address it, so I'm going to return to this comment made earlier by one of my colleagues. But Table 1, which is in the staff report on page 6, as a practitioner, I look at things like this particular table, and I get very excited. I would like to ask, once the document has been adopted and it's up and running accurately, to include something like this on the website, sort of as a user manual. When I go to the website with a new project, the first thing I need to do is figure out the process that's connected specifically to the property. And each property is very different, even if the project may be identical to a previous project, the zone, the neighborhood, the details of each property is so different that a chart like this would help any homeowner or any applicant to know where their starting point is. And I would recommend hyperlinks. When we recognize that this is where we need to go, we click on that and we go straight to that section. I also want to commend the effort of creating a new title. A whole new title, Title 25. That was my first question when I had a private conversation with Ms. Dieste is this separate from everything else? Yes, it is. And that leads to my next question, which is, when in doubt, what do we default to? Do we default to Title 30? Do we default to something else if it's a subdivision map or something like that? Could you answer that on record for us?
Chair Bonderson, so if you're using Title 25, you would default to Title 25, but when in doubt, the rest of the Muni Code, there's actually a larger version of this table that's in the front of the document that details that if you're doing the subdivision, you go here to Title 27. If you're doing tree removal, you go to, I think it's Title 15. So I think it's all clearly laid out in more detail than was in your staff report. Where do you go?
Mm-hmm. And that Commissioner Wiscombe's comment on this topic made me think of, I may date myself here, but I think most of us in this room either use these books ourselves or maybe had children using the Choose Your Own Adventure books where you get to the bottom of the page and if you want to do a subdivision map, turn to this page. But if you choose to do a design project, go to that chapter. So this is sort of what the document feels like to me. And I just have to say I'm personally thrilled to see the development of this Title 25. Other agencies, as you know, have documents like this already. Just here locally with the County of Santa Barbara, they have design guidelines for all their different neighborhoods. The Mission Canyon has their own design guidelines. Summerlin has their own design guidelines. And there's not a lot of room for confusion. If you have a project in that area, you use their municipal code, their land use development code, and you have your design guidelines side by side. This is very exciting to me because I love to follow the rules. I love to know where I need to go. I love to get the answers to my questions instead of asking somebody every single time I have a question and bothering other people or returning multiple times when I could just refer to a document that hopefully is pretty clear. So, this is really wonderful. The direction we're going is great. So my next question is, I know this may be addressed in some ways already, but I would like to hear it. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about it. In the questions, or I should say in the comments from the working group members, somebody specifically, I believe it was Pat Saley, had a comment, and it was addressed having to do with community open spaces and then the introduction of the civic space language. Do you remember do you know what I'm talking about? Here I can refer to it in a second. If you give me 2 seconds, I can go to the page. I can give you a page number. Page 22. Tell me. Was it 3G? 3G, let me see. I think I have it tagged.
Is this page 22 of the staff report?
Yeah, I think it's, oh, you know what? Yes, I got it, and thank you for your help, Commissioner Boss. Page 33, it's 11G, it's from Pat Saley, and it says that she wholeheartedly endorses the civic spaces, and then it says draft ODDS renamed civic spaces to community open spaces. So I just wanted to build on this. I wanted to know a little bit more about what your definition is on a civic space, because the State Street Advisory Committee is also using this term, and I want to make sure that we share the same term. If we're starting to use this language across multiple boards, I want to make sure that we're starting to define it in equal terms. Would you share from your point of view?
Yeah, from my point of view, Chair Bonderson, I remember when this was in the admin draft, the civic spaces, and then we had a lot of debate internally about that title and if it made sense, and it was our recommendation to change it to community open spaces. We just felt civic space was a little confusing for people, and we weren't, like you said, not sure if it could be defined. And in our view, at least the way it's applied to large sites, it's a privately owned space that's open to the public. So it's, we narrowed it down to be a paseo or a park or a plaza, but that's, when you have that larger site, we felt like it was important that the developer provide that. It's not necessarily owned and maintained by the city of Santa Barbara as a park, but it's treated that way.
Excellent. And I wanted to ask you personally, Ms. Deisty, is there any opportunity for you to coordinate that term with Ms. Harris from the State Street Advisory Committee so that perhaps she would be able to share the goal of this term, and so we can all start using the same language? I think it would be very helpful for us as a community to learn the term and to use it equally.
Certainly, Chair Bonderson, I mean, we work in the same office, and I
Right.
could talk to her about how they're defining civics. They use the term civic space now?
It came up recently in the May, we had 2 meetings back-to-back in May,
Okay.
and that term sort of popped up, everyone got excited about it, but I want to sort of slow it down if we're not going to move forward with that term, and just make sure that as a community, I mean, the public as well as city staff, that we are all on the same page. I think it's always really useful for us to be using the right language, the same language, so there's no confusion in the long term across the larger community.
Okay.
If possible. I mean, that's always the hope, right? Thank you. If you could do that, that would be lovely. The next question has to do with your slide, Ms. Dicey, slide 16. It was the one where you had the dots, the colorful dots. That was really fast. Okay. Now, you spoke about this, it feels like a lifetime ago, it was just 2 hours ago, but could you go into a little bit more detail on why you chose to drop darker dots onto the different sections of color so that we understand what those may stand for and how they are being used for your interpretation of whatever it is you're going to tell us?
Okay. Certainly, Chair Bonderson. So again, I'll kind of back up. created this map before the public review draft was released, and the colors are different from what you're seeing in the document because we needed, honestly, we knew we were going to this open house and we needed colors that matched dots that we could buy at the store. So that's why you're not seeing the same color scheme, but what it shows is the same. And what we wanted to do is we knew there was this city open house coming, and we realized we haven't done a lot of out before the general public talking about this project, so we thought this is a great opportunity to at least let the public weigh in on our initial recommendations for style limitations or not. And so what we asked the public to do, we gave them a bunch of different colored dots and said, if you agree, let's just take the blue. If you agree that all three style groups should be in these areas that we indicated on the map, put a blue dot on the blue color. And same thing for green and yellow. We didn't go to a whole lot of detail with folks participating in this about what we were doing and why. It was just not the right venue for that, but they were eager to listen to us and got excited about participating. So some people did multiple dots. You know, we didn't really limit them. We just said, let us know if you agree with this or not. And I actually have a summary in my notes of what these dots mean. So for example, we found when we looked at the colors that most participants agreed with our initial style direction, but for example, on the west side, we got some people, we had 5 dots that said it should be restricted to Mediterranean and Craftsman, and 7 dots to allow all styles. We had some mixed areas like Hidden Valley, which you can't, I don't know if you can see this arrow here. There's 3 different colored dots, so it's hard to know what people thought of that area. Some people thought it should just be Mediterranean, one person agreed with us, and one person thought it should be all styles. So does that explain a little better how this works?
It sure does. And
Yeah.
my follow-up question is how much, this is obviously an input map. How much of this is dictating your decisions as a consultant team or as a staff member on what we may want to assign to these spaces for
Okay.
the purpose of our conversation here today?
Yeah, Chair Bonderson, I'll go ahead and answer this because I think Opticos is really relying on us for this direction. But, you know, it was one effort that didn't have a huge amount of participants. So I wouldn't say this is representative of the whole community. It's something we talked about actually doing an online version of this and broadcasting it, you know, more fully, which is still an option. It would just take a little staff time and maybe it might slow things down a little bit to wait for that participation, but that is an option to, again, some people have mentioned we should really spend more time on Milpas. Maybe that's a way we can reach out to people who live and work along Milpas and do a version of this map online to get more input. So it did inform us generally that people mostly agreed with our initial recommendations, but you know, we could always do more.
Great, and that actually leads me to my next question. I know that we are now, from today's conversation, I understand we're sensitive to a looming date where we lose our consultant. What does it take, another grant or possibly more funding assigned in a different way, if we choose to want the consultants to stay on board and complete their design styles assessment for all 9 styles, for example, or more than just the 3? Does anyone have kind of an easy answer to that? What would it take to keep them?
Chair Bonderson, I think, well, we have a couple of things. The state has a deadline for us. At one stage, and I could reach out to them again, they indicated that other people were also having trouble in the state meeting their deadlines for the LEAP grant. So it's possible. They said it would take the state legislature actually has to extend the deadline. It's not really up to the jurisdiction. So I could ask them again if that's an option. But if we're asking Opticos to do more work than what's already in their scope, we would definitely need to get more funding, and I'm not sure where that would come from at this time.
Okay. I just will echo my colleagues' sentiments that it's a shame not to have those options. It feels like it's an incomplete document simply because we don't want to limit our community to 3 for no other reason than we ran out of time. If it's 3 because we want 3, that's fine. But if it's 3 because we didn't have time to evaluate the other options, that's a pity. I will continue forward. I would love to rephrase Commissioner Lodge's question into my own. It was a conversation I had with you, Ms. Deisty, yesterday, and I'd love to hear it again for the record. How is ODDS beneficial, and how does it necessarily affect us as a planning commission?
Chair Bonderson, I think the first word that comes to my mind is predictability as being beneficial. I think someone who chooses to use this product, provided they design, they read it, they understand what's in it, they submit plans that meet this product, they're going to get through the system presumably faster than somebody else going through normal design review process. And it's more predictable, so they should have the comfort and know that if I design my project to these specifications, the city's going to approve it. So I think that's, to me, the main, and the other benefit is that it's not just that, it's because we put the care into it to have pedestrian facing, that's a big portion of this, is all the frontages and everything's pedestrian facing, and the care to have special standards if it's a bigger building next to a smaller building, and the historic resources and all those things together. So it's a benefit to the city as well that we're going to get a nice product under the state law restrictions and all those other things.
And what type of projects would then come to the Planning Commission? How would it affect us as a commission?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I'm not as familiar with what goes to you now. I don't know if Ms. DeBusk wants to weigh in.
So Chair Bonderson, subdivisions go to the Planning Commission. Sometimes they go to the staff hearing officer depending on the number of lots proposed, but that would continue as under the current proposals. As Ms. Deisty had mentioned earlier, and maybe you've seen it in the document, if a project is proposing any type of a modification, that kicks them out of using this. So then those would follow the standard procedure.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to tack on a comment here. I really appreciate Chapter 9, the exceptions section, and I also appreciate the opportunity for a project to opt out completely, and if they don't want to follow these guidelines, they can take their chances in discretionary review. I think that's wonderful, and I hope that that's obvious to anyone who may look at this as a limiting factor. I think it's not limiting. I think it's just help, and it gives you direction, and you certainly can jump right out and take another pathway that's always been available. Continuing forward, I will comment on or ask a question based on the consultant's presentation. Mr. Pellegrini, you recognized that the height issue and building adjacency was a key discussion in your work, and it led your development of this document. You found that those topics were key discussions at the design review boards. My question is, did you address this issue specifically based on those types of discussions that you witnessed or that you reviewed? Or did you do a little bit of a mix based on your experience elsewhere in comparison to the types of comments you saw happening at the design review boards? What do we see in the final product?
Thank you, Chair Bonderson. That's an excellent question. We did do some analysis that looked at the zoning envelope that was allotted to projects and their built results, and then we analyzed specifically the difference and that we often did see that there was a reduction in zoning envelope, which under current state law has become more challenging for review boards to do. So I would say that the transitional standards that are in Chapter 3 are actually sort of very specifically tailored to the situations that we saw here. And Tony and I were speaking this morning, they are at a level of refinement that I think other communities will want to learn from.
That's exciting to hear. And I'm glad to know that you're specifically focusing on our local examples to define the chapter. My next question has to do with Chapter 4, just continuing along from your presentation. Your presentation, in your presentation, you described adding, in an example where you're adding multiple buildings to a site to perhaps break up the intensity versus a single larger structure. My question in that type of example is, are you also recommending reduced parking and reduced open yard when you are breaking it up and dividing up the structures in order to possibly provide that type of open space between them? How do you address that? I mean, I can read it, but I was hoping more for you to describe it just in layman's terms to us. When you recommend or when you add a section with this option, it's not necessarily a recommendation, but you're offering an option, what is the benefit to that option?
Sure, thank you, Chair Bonderson. And I'll start this question and then maybe Tony can respond as well. Is the building types in general try to reflect the scale of development that's seen in the neighborhoods today? There are some specific building types which are trying to promote that scale, keeping in mind more creative or innovative ways to deal with things like vehicular access. This side court building type is an example of that, where units could be organized along the side of a long, narrow lot, and a shared driveway, sort of common open space could be developed adjacent to those units. And there's some really great exemplars of that in Santa Barbara, which other communities don't see. And so we sought to emulate that and standardize that as an option. That's one example, I think, of where things are coming together. Tony, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes. Yes, Chair Bonderson. Yeah, so I'm looking especially at the duplex court type. It's one of the types that shows more than one building on a lot. And this is a really, this is a nuance, but it's a foundational approach to the way that these standards are prepared. At the scale of one lot, that is the size of a lot that would otherwise hold one building the size of a house. I know that's a long sentence, but just think about that scale. It's another thing to have multiple buildings on that size of a lot, right? So the size of buildings that you can have on a size of a lot that scale are smaller in footprint, and they're going to be house scale buildings. And so that idea is coordinated with lots of a certain scale. Lots that can have, you've seen the term in here, design sites, multiple design sites that can each hold a building or buildings, plural. That's a larger piece of property. And so the whole approach to buildings on one site is scalable from the scale of one lot that holds what you would otherwise see as a house to a site that holds buildings that could be as big as this one and have multiple buildings on that property. So I just wanted to give you a little insight and background to how this is built.
No, it's to me, it's very encouraging to see multiple options provided in a document like this, and it allows a designer to sort of be spoon-fed, for lack of a better term, that, hey, if you haven't thought of this, maybe you want to consider this. And here's some ways to do better design that fits our community. So I appreciated it. I was mostly interested in understanding maybe your thought process on how you were offering it to us, but the diagrams and so on really helped. I personally really like the visual aids. I'm personally a visual person, and I know many architects and designers have that visual skill, so they're the ones using this more often than not, so it's very useful to have that as well. I commend you for adding those. My next comment goes back to the staff report to page 23, to the comments. 4G is the comment specifically. It's from Mr. Sweeney. And it has to do, let me find it. Yeah. It has to do with his term, which I really appreciated, whimsical projects. Am I clear to understand that those types of whimsical projects that don't necessarily fit into these guidelines would then just opt out and take on their own pathway? We're not limiting those types of projects.
Yes, Chair Bonderson, this came up a lot with the work group, and you're correct. If somebody wants to do, Jeff Shelton often comes to mind in his whimsical designs, and they wouldn't strictly fit in with all the, dimensions and things that are in this document. So then they would, that project is welcome to go to design review.
Yeah, I really want to take a moment on record to address that. I want to make sure that anybody who may be following this that feels burdened by a document of this length and limitation recognizes that we are not stopping them. We're encouraging them to have another pathway, and that pathway has always been the pathway. There's nothing new to most of our unique designers in town to keep up the creativity. So next, I want to quickly ask you, it's a continuation of a previous comment, although I have to apologize, I don't remember which one of my colleagues made it. It was with response to Mr. Boland's public comment on sea rise. Now, you already addressed it, but my interest is, would you please take just an additional moment to speak on how we default to other documents when topics like this come up? And in the future, for example, based on his comment, he's saying by X year, the areas that are on our map that are zoned for this type of effort may no longer be applicable because the sea level will have risen by then. How do you project the future? Do you just plan to reassign the map several years from now to say, okay, the time has come? How do we plan as a city to address that concern?
Chair Bonderson, I'll try to answer this, and maybe Mr. Gullett will want to step in. Again, as he mentioned, so if a project subject to sea level rise, it's likely in the coastal zone. And our coastal land use plan has anticipated that scenario. We have a screening map, and so projects, they're still going to need a coastal land use permit, any kind of project that would be a multi-unit housing project. And they would still need to conform to the coastal land use plan policies. That's always, the Coastal Commission would not certify this for use in the coastal zone unless it respected coastal resources. So that would be taken into consideration. As far as, on the other hand, I know I mentioned the city's working on a sea level rise adaptation plan, and there are, I don't know where we are in that process, but I think knowing that sea level rise is coming, there's different options the city will be taking to respond to that. So it could be that, yes, the maps show sea level will be I think he mentioned 6.6 feet. But maybe we'll have measures in place, or things will get risen higher, or whatever it is that's in that adaptation plan to plan for that, looking 100 years into the future. And so hopefully, if homes are in the way of this, it's been accounted for.
Excellent. I really want to get that general feedback on record, and thank you for taking the time to put it into words. I would also assume that the default would be to go to Title 28 until a coastal version of the ODDS is eventually created and put into effect. Is that right?
Yes, Chair Bonderson. Yeah, for now, Title 28 is what prevails in the coastal zone.
Perfect. I'm almost done. I just have a couple comments since we're using this as our deliberation as well, I wanted to ask you, as a city, what type of software, and you may not have a specific answer, but what type of software are we using? And does it have the ability to be programmed so that if you edit one section, for example, Commissioner Wiscombe was talking about helping not have to correct in multiple places. If you adjust one, does it automatically adjust the other sections that may be linked to that same section or to the same language? Do you have that? Do you have the ability to help you save time?
Chair Bonderson, I think at present, my answer would be no. I don't know if anyone else knows, but I think we are, when we amend Title 30, for example, we're still using Word software. This document, though, is unique in that it's produced in InDesign, which is, much nicer, easier to use. That's why it's so graphically beautiful, and staff has actually granted licenses for InDesign, so we can, once the consultant is finished and has turned the product over to us, if there's edits that need to be made, we can make those edits because we have the software. We're still working, all of our zoning or municipal code is online, and there's various ways that gets posted, and we're still trying to work all that out because typically it's a PDF or a Word document, and this is different. That's one of the things we need to work on and figure out how we can do that. But as far as linking everything together, that sounds wonderful, but I don't think we're there yet.
Well, I was going to say, I know this is not the forum to come up with the solution, but if there is some sort of funding set aside for miscellaneous, you may want to consider putting it on that type of effort where it reduces the workload and your time as staff members can be used more efficiently in the future. There are ways. I think InDesign has a way. You just have to program it. So if you haven't done it yet, please look into it. I really hope to reduce your workload. And then with regard to also possibly finding ways to go around the lack of completing the sections on other architectural styles, you may want to just put a bullet point or disclaimer or a note in there that says something like, for other architectural styles, go to, like the choose your own adventure, go to your discretionary review. Because I don't want the document to make it feel like you have no option. I would like personally to see those options addressed and then go in this direction. And we know internally that it's going there because we don't have a discussion on it yet. We haven't been able to have a consultant describe it for us yet, but it would be wonderful to address it so that any applicant knows that, hey, there is still a pathway. It's going to be reviewed in this other manner. If we can add language, that would be lovely. And I think also to the comment that Vice Chair Bauke mentioned, just to build on his comment about walkability or smaller scale would be better in Santa Barbara when discussing the block sizes. I would personally like to add a request to provide that range when you do come back, something that's very specific to the Santa Barbara community. And I don't expect that every zone or every neighborhood will be the same. So there may need to be a little bit of an analysis added where it says in this area colored by such and such, here's your range. It might be 1600 to 1800 in this range, depending on the block. And then you will actually refer to on this block, or refer to the block itself, and that lands you in your range. So you're not doing all the homework for people, but you're giving us the answer and allowing staff to then be more specific in the future when a project comes up that's very specific. I think it would help back up the specifics that are unique to the community. Yeah, instead of just giving us this works in general. Lastly, I would just mention, I don't know if we have room for this in the part 2 comments, so I'm just going to plant it here. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head the questions, but discussing the 14 versus the 12 on the ground floor, I am personally very, very supportive of the mixed-use design in the downtown core. But I would also be open to reducing the 14 to 12 just to help reduce height or to use the height in different ways, not making it a requirement, a hard 14. And last but not least, again, just building on the comments that several of my colleagues talked about, especially Vice Chair Bauke, using the specific example of 701 Milpas, I would also be in support of, well, no, I can't say I would also be, because I don't think that's what he said. I would just state on my own that I would be supportive of providing flexibility on intensive projects to allow a developer to provide increased housing stock. Because as Vice Chair Bauke mentioned, when we do enforce a certain type of design style and it increases the cost of the building, then we may face a decrease in the number of units or other ways that they're trying to achieve the cost versus what they're providing. And in an effort to help encourage the increase to housing stock, I would be more supportive of flexible design in those situations. But we can go into that perhaps in part two. So I will close my part one comments. But before I do so, I would like to just be fair and open this up. Does anyone have any other part one type questions or comments now? No. Okay. Ms. Dicey, please present us with your questions, and based on the order that your name pops up on my screen, I will let you go page by page, questions 1 through 4, and give feedback to staff. Who would like to go first? No. Okay, if you don't have specific feedback, you can pass, or if you just want to comment on one of the questions, or if you choose to do all 4, you're welcome to. But I do want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity, if they choose, to provide feedback. Yeah, and do you have a question on the process?
I just want to make a comment or a
Please.
question. You know, everything we discussed today is a lot of good input and everything, but we have to realize that when you go back and you evaluate this, it still falls into the criteria of the odds, ODDS, and also what the state was sort of mandating that evolved into this new way of looking at things. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Anything, recommendations we take, definitely have to stay within the boundaries of, it has to remain objective and meet the intent of state law.
Thank you.
And can I just preface too really quick on the questions? Again, as I mentioned earlier, we were originally just coming in with an overview and didn't plan on delving into details on these questions. So I think I just want to say I would have prepared better with maybe a map that we could have looked at closer and talked about, and so I'm not prepared with that today. But I'm still happy that we can discuss this and you can give us input. It's just not set up to do like an interactive map or anything like that.
Thank you, Ms. Dicey. So we'll do our best to provide you with any type of feedback that the commissioners may be ready to provide. And please, no pressure on anyone if you're not ready or if you'd prefer to think about it and send comments via email. I'm sure staff would be more than appreciative. So I will begin with who's on my screen. We have Vice Chair Bauke.
Madam Chair, thank you. I went through and wrote down my responses to all the questions that were in the staff report, so I'm just going to go through them one by one, and some of them I sort of added into my commentary, and I'll shorten those comments appropriately. As to the question as to, do you agree with the proposed maps as to the use maps, as I've noted before, and I would, in some respects, I'm concerned about La Cumbre Plaza, and honestly think we should have a discussion of whether it should actually be given a greater intensity than what you're proposing and go to the DE designation, or potentially even to the DC. Because, I mean, it is going to be an open process, and is one of the places in which we can make the most impact on our housing needs. It should be honestly looked at in the context of a specific plan, but I'm not sure if we're going to get there. But if not, we surely should have some clear definitions, and the amount of intensity that can be handled at that location is actually quite high if we can address a number of other issues, especially the school issues. Question and a comment as to the funk zone. I was wondering why it was given the designation DE. I think that's a little bit too intense for the funk zone. I believe it probably should have been given the multi-use corridor designation. I think we've sort of over-intensified that particular location. As I noted, and a question as to why would the Haley and Milpas corridors have the lower intensity designation that currently is being proposed. I believe it should be higher, consistent with some of the approvals that we have given especially on Milpas, 701 Milpas being an example. And I did ask the question, which begs, consideration of up at the Mesa as to whether both sides of Cliff should have the multi-use corridor designation, just like Coast Village Road. I sort of look at those two areas as sort of being quite similar, at least their future should be fairly similar as to the intensity. We might want to consider renaming the districts especially if we start looking at putting like the Milpas corridor into a different, upping its intensity. Might want to consider, core or neighborhood center or some other term. There's a number of terms in the Transact that could be used. Just using the name core or downtown sort of leads you that it has to be next to downtown. And we probably, if we get away from that, it might be appropriate. As to the architectural styles map, as I brought up before, I'm very, very concerned of the area on the Milpas corridor and the Haley corridor, and potentially, and this is an area I have yet sort of resolved in my mind, as to the De La Vina corridor, the extent of contemporary that should be allowed. I think on the Milpas and Haley corridor, contemporary should be something, if somebody wants to go there, they go through our normal process. They shouldn't be able to use this process for that. And as I mentioned in passing, but I think I'll be much more clear, we need to be very cautious to any allowance for the contemporary style. It's the beast that needs to be on a very short leash. And the reason for that is it will be the developer's default style, since it's easier to construct, design, and build, and cost less. My question is how Santa Barbara is that style. To me, it's an exception, not the rule, and what we should be putting into the context of the ODS is the rule, not the exception. And I talked about examples of what you will get, both on Milpas and the project that was at the ABR on Haley Street as examples of what you will get, even through our current process if we allow contemporary to be considered. I think I'm on to the next slide. Yeah, I think as to the adjacency standards or new infill, I think they have proposed what I would consider best practice methodology. I think the Architectural Review Board and HLC may have some details on that, but I think this is what you do. This is how you do it. And then whether we've done it perfectly, I don't know, but I think this is how you have to address that particular concern, and I think they've done it as well as possible. I think we have a next question as to the ground floor residential. I believe that is completely appropriate and should be honestly the default. And that should just be what we expect in the core. And if somebody wants to do something different than that, that's an exception, and they should go through the other process. Because the whole point of the core is to keep to activate the street for the pedestrians, and doing other uses and things other than that tend to do exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. As to the open yard, we've had, and I think we had a discussion on the project of Milpas at the Tri-County Produce, how the second floor open yard stuff that was proposed there didn't count. And I think we should, consider having open yards be basically either done the way they have, which isn't being addressed, or actually work on our calculation, which would be more flexible as how it's calculated, and actually projects like the courtyard area that was an open yard area within that project should have been counted, honestly. But for some reason, our code doesn't allow that. So we should address that somewhere in this process. Next slide, or is that it?
That was the end of the 4 questions.
No, well, you had one in your staff report.
There's a few more in the staff report.
Okay, so let me go back to those. Your question was the draft ODS replaces density standards in the zoning ordinance, but is it consistent with the densities in a general plan, and are there situations which you would increase density should be allowed? And I'll put it on the record, the answer to that from my point of view is yes. But when we do that, additional deed-restricted affordable housing should be allowed when we do that. Also, you had a question as to the elimination of parking. Let's see, where's your question here? Oh yeah, it was part of that same question. Okay, I'll read the question. Should new residential and mixed-use projects in downtown core, i.e. Straight Street from Highway 101 to Sola, allow unlimited density or no open yard and no parking? And my response to that was the elimination of parking should be tied to increase affordable housing. Not hard to do the math of what the changes are to the land residual value of the land when you eliminate parking spaces at a cost of around $65,000 a space. Failure to tie the elimination of parking to affordability is simply a gift to the landowner, and which just increases the land residual value in his selling price. And it is not in the public interest to simply make that gift without giving the affordable housing in return. So I think those are the comments, and I did have one other I think you had addressed. Yeah, you had a question about basically most parcels in the project area are smaller size lots or less than 60 by 100, and should the ODS allow for more duplexes in the R2 zone than is currently allowed by the zoning ordinance, which currently requires a 6,000 square foot minimum. And I did a little work on that, and actually it was interesting. One of the first sources I went to is a book these two folks know very well, which written by one of their partners. And I don't know, Stefan, if you drew some of the drawings in those, but I believe we could probably think about going to smaller sizes for the duplex lot provisions. But what I noted and would be clear is to how the property is accessed, whether it's front-loaded or rear-loaded, and whether it's stacked or side by side. That needs to be very clear. We've got side by side and stacked in the ODS right now, but, and with the square footage, is just a lot, but we don't really tie those two to access. And I think so there's probably an A and B to both of those that could be added, which would allow for smaller lot sizes. So, and then I wanted to bring up another thing, which is I believe there's a building type that needs to be thought of or incorporated, in which I provided the commissioners a handout from the New Urban Best Practices Manual, the 4th edition, in which I personally retained Opticos to create a number of years ago, which is a multi-generational house program. And I'd like to see a discussion of how that could be incorporated. I think it might actually fall within a sort of a subset of probably the side court would be probably a guess, but I want to make sure that some kind of form of that kind of building type might be able to be used, since it really clearly could be used in the east and west side, especially with the lot depths, and some of them even have alleys, that we could actually do a lot towards our affordable housing by allowing that as a by right with these ODS type standards. So that's all my comments for today. Thank you. And you guys did a great job.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bauke, and thank you for all your due diligence. It's nice to know that you're on this work group as well. I really appreciated hearing all your thoughts.
Thank you.
I do not have any volunteers. Is there anyone who'd like to go next? Okay, thank you. Commissioner Lodge, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not prepared to answer these questions because as I read the staff report, those were going to come next time when you come back. And so I can't accept some of the issues. Ms. Dicey, could you bring up slide 12, please? This is the front page of this document. And when I sat down to review it for this meeting, I saw these images, and I thought, is this what we are working toward in Santa Barbara? For me, the answer is absolutely not. And it took me a while to get back to the document. I was so flummoxed by this, but that just isn't Santa Barbara. And it's like ignoring and then the different styles. That one I can answer. I'd like to see the contemporary go away. Our city charter for the ABR says that it shall be is to be guided in approving any permit by the protection and preservation of the natural charm and beauty of the area in which the city is located, and the historical style, qualities, and characteristics of the buildings, structures, and architectural features associated with and established by its long, illustrious, and distinguished past. This doesn't mean that every building has to be white stucco and red tile roof. Actually, and good architecture doesn't really cost more than bad. All around the Mediterranean, all the countries there have very simple architecture, many of them very simple architecture, including Spain, that being used can have the grace and elegance and timeless quality that has been established as the Santa Barbara tradition. So I just can't support this document as it is currently written. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Boss, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think today I'm only prepared to respond to the first question about the maps. So just a couple of points. One, in the staff report, it notes that Victorian styles were observed but not documented. And based on consultants' and staff recommendation, Victorian styles were not considered for the odds at this time. And based on my own observations and experiences, and then also a lot of the public comment, I would appreciate that being reconsidered in this document. And then another comment in response to number one, kind of thinking about, actually one of the public comments that was written, I think in the chart, was the work of this committee needs to assure the community that we will not repeat or encourage the mediocrity of architectural solutions we see in other cities. And I know there's a reference to making sure that Santa Barbara stays uncommonplace. And I worry sometimes that if we're thinking about pretty or classic Santa Barbara and the Mediterranean, it seems like it's especially, I understand that it's part of EPV, but I worry that it's just focused where wealthier people live or frequent. And I wonder how that impacts the areas outside of EPV. So not that it's anything goes outside of that area. And I understand that it's the three different categories, but just something that I've been thinking about, and just I worry that we're directing people to one specific area and that's what we want to be, and I don't think that's what we want to be. Those are my only comments for today.
Thank you, Commissioner Boss. Next, we have Commissioner Wiscombe, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too am not ready to respond. I didn't know we were actually going over these questions today. But I'm going to just take a minute to address some of the things that Vice Chair Bauke said, because I think it's important. And it's hard for me to read this map, and I haven't really examined it carefully, but he did say that the funk zone is the downtown edge, and maybe that's too intense. I think that's what he said. And I would probably agree with that comment. I was also intrigued by him calling I think it was the downtown core, maybe calling it something else, because it could apply maybe to other areas. So it's not, we're not concentrating it downtown. I think, if you go to the Milpas corridor, we're doing some pretty intense development over there, and that could also be perhaps a core area. I think Vice Chair Bauke said the Haley-Milpas corridor could be higher. And I think that's something worthy of exploring if you change downtown core to something that, perhaps can cover some other areas. The Mesa is a mixed-use corridor, I think. I live there. And I wanted to talk just about the architectural styles. We seem to be concentrating on the word contemporary, and it really was contemporary/industrial, I think, is what the notation was. And I think that we do have an area in the city that's defined in our, at least in our local coastal program, I think, as being industrial zone. So I think and you look at the funk zone, and it very definitely has the industrial look to it. So I think that we maybe need to move, or we need to consider that this is not just contemporary style, it's also industrial style. And we do have areas of the city where that architecture would match perfectly with the feel of the area. That said, I think that there might be more outreach done on perhaps places like the Milpas corridor to see if that's if contemporary/industrial really fits there. And that would be more neighborhood outreach. A couple commissioners talked about that. So those are my comments there. But, and I think it's worthy of reminding the public that, we're limited to 3 styles. Or 3 main architectural styles. And I think that our consultants have covered it well, because those are, and there are subsets of those styles, definitely, and that will fit into this document, but also subsets that perhaps will stray from it, and then we'll go back to the subjective design standards, or our normal design standards. Okay, I just wanted to see if there's any other questions here I can answer. Hold on. Yeah, I'm not really ready to answer the questions about increased density. I think that for number 4, the open yard, I think more flexibility is definitely in order there. I can comment on that. And I also really appreciate the public open spaces in some of these larger projects. And I'm going to go back to something that Vice Chair Bauke said much earlier, if I could ever find my notes, but he was talking about we have the 3-acre projects, but perhaps bringing that down. I think that's worthy of consideration, to bring that down to 2 acres or whatever. I think that might be important. That, I think, might better fit the scale of our city, but that's at least worthy of looking at that. And I think that's I could comment on maybe most parcels in the project area are smaller lot sizes. Should ODDS allow for more duplexes in the R2 zone than is currently allowed? I think that's worthy of exploration. The 6,000 square foot lot is maybe constraining, and maybe staff can pile on a little more work, and sorry about that, but, see if it's possible. I think the more flexibility we can provide to provide housing, I think is the better off we are. So, and I just want to thank you all, staff, the consultants, and the whole work group. You've just done a great job to date. This is a highly complex document. When I first looked at it, I really couldn't support it, but your presentation today and the thoughtfulness of my fellow commissioners in discussing it has really put me in another place. So, and I think I'll look forward when it comes back to us. I think it's going to be a really great document. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Next, we have Commissioner DeLuccio, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to say too much at this point, but I want to thank staff again. You did a great job on this, and the consultants, and it's given me the inspiration, actually. I didn't have a lot of time to spend the last week on this, but now I'm just going to dive into the website, because there's a lot of wonderful information there. The one thing I think I share a lot of things with my fellow commissioners and staff, but I think, again, we do need to look at Haley, Melpis, and even Dean Street, the architectural styles on those streets. And as far as R2 zone allowing for duplexes, that's a worthy endeavor also, in the spirit of actually trying to create more housing in our city. I can go on and on, but I'm not at this point. I am going to do, again, a lot more digging into this, and I know how to get a hold of staff. And maybe staff can give me another, like they did on the housing element, maybe they can give me another we can meet at a future date to go over this in some more detail. Thank you. I know it's coming back to us as well.
Thank you. And I just want to double check so I don't miss anyone. Does anyone else want to make a comment? Commissioner Wardlow, please.
Sure. Thank you, staff, and thank you to the consultants for this presentation. This has been really in the weeds, and I do appreciate it. I feel like I've learned a lot in this hearing. I really commend a lot of the comments of my fellow commissioners. I think this is a really tough thing. I think, not having the subjectiveness is obviously a goal to streamline, but it also has concerns. I think that, one of the questions noting, does this adequately address neighborhood compatibility? It's really hard to say how we're going to adequately address neighborhood compatibility from a non-subjective process, but I think that's what you all are trying really hard to do. So I appreciate all of the work, and I support many of the comments of my fellow commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have Commissioner Boss again. Please, go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to pile on the gratitude because I realized I had not done that yet. I didn't follow along with the process really from fall 2021 until now, but you made the materials public and you made all of the materials available, which was incredibly helpful. Although I felt like I've spent a lot of time on YouTube. I think it was 9 hours of meetings, but just thank you for having those available, and the slide decks, the agendas. It's really accessible for folks who weren't able to be part of the process live. And I saw along the way that you did a lot of work to remove any duplication and make materials, make this draft a lot more concise, and really to make it as objective and prescriptive as possible, which I think is going to be really beneficial to practitioners. So thank you for making it public and useful, and I really felt like I was in the process, even though I wasn't, so thank you.
That was a very nice comment, Commissioner Boss. Thank you for speaking on that. It just demonstrates the effort pushed forward by this group. Ms. Deisty, it's my turn, and I can do very well to stay organized if you give me the questions. I will be pulling answers from different spots, so bear with me. I wanted to start by saying, for question number 1, I have no problem with the zone names and designations, but as we have discussed as a group, it's disappointing that we can't have more of the styles demonstrated. However, I do believe that there are professional ways to go around that by simply adding some language that describes if you want to go outside of the 3 defined architectural styles that are provided, that this is where you would go. And it doesn't mean that it's not possible, it just means that you leave this document and you go to a different process. Because the comment of contemporary has come up a few times, I'd like to address my personal opinion on that. I really appreciate Commissioner Lodge's comment about timeless architecture, timeless design, and timeless quality of the Santa Barbara traditional style. I do agree with that. And my personal favorite is our Mediterranean, our Italian, our Spanish style. If it were me designing, that's what I would do. However, that is not always everyone's preference, and I would like to make sure that that is addressed. And I think that there's room for that if we look at the zones one by one. I do not necessarily believe that it is applicable in our EPV area, our downtown core of State Street perhaps, because we're trying to create a look. I'm completely supportive of keeping that contemporary out of that specific area, and I believe that it's already been addressed. I don't think it's even up for consideration. That being said, if a family on the Mesa may, I'm using that as an example, may like to design and apply for a permit for a more contemporary project, then it goes through discrimination, discretionary review, then the different groups that it will go through to be evaluated can make that decision. And we have to trust the process, we have to trust our design boards, and we have to trust our staff to make those decisions as they fit within the specific neighborhoods and zoning areas. So that being said, I'm not personally closed-minded to seeing a contemporary house being proposed here and there, depending on whether it fits the neighborhood. Goes back to neighborhood compatibility, and we have language for that. Moving forward, I also want to just mention, I completely understand and appreciate Commissioner Lodge's comment on the cover images. I didn't even pay attention to it, but when you were speaking, I looked at it and I can see how that could be very discouraging. So even though it's just a detail and it's hopefully not going to distract you from the more important things, you may want to reconsider your cover. Moving on to question 2, I took some extra time to go through this section more than once. I thought this was a very important question that I found in the staff report. And I wanted to say I really appreciate how it's been approached. I appreciate all of the options. I appreciate the diagrams. I think as a practitioner, it's very helpful to have the guidance and the descriptions that give us a variety of approaches. And I think that it also demonstrates best practices. I'm comfortable supporting question 2. Moving on to question 3, that was the ground floor non-residential. I am a huge supporter of this model, the mixed use, making ground floor commercial space open for the public. I think it activates the street, it draws people to spend time on that street, making it more viable for walking, public access. It also increases spending. It helps us increase and improve our economy. It allows creation of employment and just an improved standard of living. If somebody wants to have that lifestyle and chooses to live there, then they're going to be expecting activity around the clock. And I personally lived abroad. I lived in Italy for the better part of a decade. And I lived around the corner from a main street that had this type of ground floor activation. But the moment you turned that corner and all the ground floors were residential, it was dark, it never felt safe. You know, it was mainly for people to go home. And so there wasn't a lot of activity and it didn't feel comfortable. So I believe that when we are focusing on the downtown core, whatever that is defined as to be, having that activation will really draw that type of vibrancy that we're looking for, both in this document and also what the State Street Advisory Committee is working towards. So again, having that collaboration with the other planners in your office, maintaining that conversation, making sure that the language matches civil spaces versus community open spaces, whatever that looks like, keep in touch with each other. It'll help us as a community. Moving on to the next and last question, I believe very strongly that we have an opportunity with Title 25 to encourage the use of ODDS. We want people to choose this when applicable, and providing more flexibility would encourage the use of this document. It would encourage the applicant to follow the guidelines because they want that flexibility and they want to stay here. They don't want to go to the discretionary review and lose that advantage. So I always feel like more flexibility in the open yard would certainly allow more flexibility in design of the structure itself, period. Also, the topic of rooftop decks, it didn't come up very much, but I do want to echo a comment that I heard earlier, and again, forgive me, I don't remember who said it, but with regard to upper floors, if possible, being counted as open yard when there is public spaces being utilized off the ground level. Just because we don't have ground level open space doesn't mean we're not providing every chance we can to get outdoor spaces for the residents. And if we can count that towards the goals, then we're going to encourage more open space, even if it's not on the ground floor. So why not? Let's get as much open space for those inhabitants. And I know Commissioner Lodge was particularly concerned about not giving private open yard balconies and outdoor spaces, but if somebody could open their front door and already be in a public space on the second floor, then they're getting the same opportunity to open their door perhaps and maybe step outside and see what the temperature is. They might not be able to do it off their living room, but they could open their front door and still access something nearby instead of having to go all the way downstairs. Your comment wasn't lost on me, Commissioner Lodge. So that being said, I just want to make sure I don't miss any. Oh, parking. It was the last comment here in your part 3 question. I'm always an advocate for inclusivity. I'm very concerned about losing all parking spaces when providing, when following the state mandated, direction of reducing parking requirements, because then you lose people who may need support, maybe the elderly, the disabled, people with families who may need a vehicle. As long as we are thinking about options and alternatives, if they have to purchase a parking spot in a nearby lot, I know that that's not here up for your group to discuss, but it's always a partnering concept with all of the direction that we go in. I also want to echo Commissioner or Vice Chair Balke's comments about the reduced parking being hand in hand with the certain types of housing development that he listed. I'm in full support of that. So those would be ways that we could use the reduction to support our community and also be mindful that we don't need to reduce the parking all the time. I believe that concludes my thoughts, and I just want to end with, again, I won't miss you, don't worry. I just want to end my own presentation. I do have other speakers, and I just want to end by saying I really appreciate the efforts here, and I'm really, really excited to see what you come back with and how much of our comments may be useful to you. And certainly if you're doing more outreach for Milpas area or the Funk Zone, La Cumbre, if you're taking that step to get more public outreach, I think it's going to be really rewarding in the end. So good luck with that. I do have one additional speaker. I have Commissioner Wiscombe. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to go back to question number 2, because I brought this up in part 1 of our, but then was told that was actually part 2. So do the proposed standards for adjacencies. This was something that Mr. Sweeney brought up. He's brought it up many, many times before. He was really worried about that, and he did give the thumbs up. I had looked at how you've got that documented and illustrated in this, and I was very pleased with that. So I think you did a fine job, and he gave a thumbs up from back there when he was still here, so he obviously agrees with that, so thank you.
I am so glad you remembered to bring that up. It's really important to add that, and I'm sorry I cut you off earlier, but I'm glad you remembered to bring it on back. It's great. I think we're leaving you with a lot of comments and a lot of feedback, and certainly we'll have another opportunity. And I do want to just extend the verbal invitation that I spoke with Ms. Deisty, and if you all have any further comments that you didn't have today here on the dais, don't hesitate to email her. She would be happy to receive anything post-hearing. Thank you to the consultants for being here today, and staff will be returning to the Planning Commission for a recommendation to City Council sometime, hopefully before the end of 2003. We look forward to seeing you again. So with that, we'll go ahead and close this item, and we'll move on to administrative agenda. We will begin with staff hearing officer liaison reports, if Commissioner Boss has any to present.
Madam Chair, no specific projects of note for the staff hearing officer, but I do want to just acknowledge they've had a lot of projects and a lot of presentations, but nothing specifically applies to Planning Commission purview.
Perfect. That's always good to hear. That's a presentation in itself. Do we have any other presenters, liaison reports today? Okay, I have a few, but I'll do my best to make it quick. ABR has met a few times, and they actually had one hearing that was just a lot of good stuff. May 30th, there was a final approval on 701 North Milpas, the one we saw, the one we talk about regularly. They received final approval. On June 26th, that's the date where we had a number of projects that would be of interest to us here, and I'll make it quick. 401 and 409 East Haley, a continued item came back for project design approval, and just as a reminder, it's a proposal for a new mixed-use development using the ADU, and it's proposing 26 residential units on that site. Next, we have another continued item that returned for project design approval, 302 and 308 West Montecito Street. This is a proposal for a 3-story development, which will then consist of 31 hotel rooms. I brought that one up in the past. It's moving along. Next, we saw 414 West Cannon Perdido come back again for final approval, and that is a proposed project for a 2-story, 2-unit residential building using the AUD program, and this project received final approval? Yes, with comments. And then we have one more at a continued item, again for project design approval, at 528 West Figueroa. And this was a proposal to demolish a existing single-family home and then to construct a 2-story, 8-unit residential apartment building using the AUD program. This one is interesting because the project proposes using the concessions from the city development standards to allow relief for parking design standards, stall maneuverability dimensions, relief from open and private yard requirements. So if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, this project is using it all to move forward. And last but not least, at 220 North La Cumbra, we have an in-progress review, which we don't see very often. The project consists of a demolition of all existing commercial buildings on the site and the construction of a new 48-unit multifamily residential development. This is a Housing Authority of Santa Barbara project, and it would be proposing deed-restricted units to low and very low income tenants with the ratios to be determined at a later time. So that concludes my presentation. I see Commissioner Lodge. Do you have anything to add here?
Yes, Commissioner Boss reminded me that she and I attended a meeting on June 29th of the 100th, the centenary of the 1925 earthquake, which is coming up in a couple of years. And there was a big crowd there, over 20 people, I think. And the idea was to, how may it be observed? What do people think should be done? And so there were all sorts of ideas put forward, and it will be an interesting period of, I think it ended up, well, one person said it should be, there was some talk of, should it be over a period of a week or a day, and one person said, for 6 months, building up to it. So, and all the museums and other entities that might be involved. So I think that it will be an interesting and educational event about what actually happened then. Santa Barbara was not destroyed by that earthquake.
That's actually really fun stuff. Thank you for sharing, and keep us posted as the dates and the activities come closer and closer. One last call if anyone has anything to say. I don't see any other lights on, so I will go ahead and move forward with adjournment. It is 4:42 p.m. That concludes our July 6th, 2023 Planning Commission hearing, and our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for next Thursday, July 13th. Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.